Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. The Canadian rocker Bryan Adams eulogized his youth in the classic song Summer of '69, and I can understand why. Being alive and being a music fan or just a rock geek in the year 1969 meant witnessing one of the most absolutely stacked years for music ever. It was also one of the most resonant. The overall tone for the next decade was set with all the musical developments and groundbreaking, classic, visionary albums that came out in this year. As we will cover in this episode, the newest installment in our second Golden Age of Rock series. The Beatles ended their glorious run with a widescreen pop epic, and the Rolling Stones hit their stride with one of rock and roll's all-time great statement albums, while at the same time arguably surpassing the Beatles as an albums band. The Who set the bar for conceptual, narrative-driven art rock, while Led Zeppelin and the Stooges presented the sound and attitude of heavy metal and punk, respectively, for the 1970s. Sly and the Family Stone and Isaac Hayes reinvented R&B and soul for the next decade, with two riveting, ambitious, epic classics. Creedence Clearwater Revival, the band, and the Allman Brothers Band released albums that virtually gave birth to Southern rock. And there were two massive festivals, Woodstock and Altamont, one that defined the entire decade for a generation, and one that ended the decade on an unbelievable low. The second Golden Age of Rock series will now take us to 1969. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
So before we go back in time to 1969, we need to cross over onto the other side of time and to go to a very, very special place where rock and roll still predominates. You've been there, haven't you, Arturo?
Many times, and I wish I could live there.
Ah, yes. It is the parallel universe, folks. We visit this realm every episode. Over there, rock and roll is still on the billboards and still sells out arenas, and we all still worship at the altar of Thin Lizzy and other bands such as that. It's a great place for rock and roll. That's a long way of saying that this is a segment in which we cover new and newish records by artists we think that you should be excited about. Although our first artist is one that you probably have heard about, but they do have a firm place on a pedestal in the parallel universe, don't they, Arturo?
Yes, I'm talking about the Black Crowes and their new album, Happiness Bastards. Now, the Black Crowes are a pretty big name band, so you might be wondering why we're putting them in our parallel universe segment. Well, while they shot up like a rocket in the early 1990s with some of the most commercially successful and critically acclaimed albums of their era, their overall popularity never quite sustained to the level of what was expected of them. Instead, they became a solid, well-respected band with a very strong cult following that has maintained them throughout the years. Well, in our curmudgeonly parallel universe, the Black Crowes never lost their commercial luster. Their cult following was even bigger, and they take the place of bands like the Dave Matthews Band. It's befitting a band that, at least in this curmudgeon's eyes, they never stopped making quality rock of the Southern fried variety. Hell, we even dedicated an entire episode to this band called An Examination of the Black Crowes. Please go back to your or any curmudgeonly archive, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and check it out if you haven't.
Yes, please.
So, of course, this brings us to this grizzled veteran band's latest album, Happiness Bastards, their first in 14 years. The Robinson brothers, lead singer Chris and guitarist Rich, are the band's founding members and to this day are the only continual members. These two have a long history of intense drama and infighting that would make the brothers in the Kinks and Oasis blush.
Oh, I'm sure.
But they have reportedly patched things up well enough to bring us this quite solid new album. By this point, no one expects the Black Crowes to reinvent the wheel. The best we can hope for is some good new music that can stand up to or at least honor their peak period of the 1990s. And for the most part, they do that here. It's a well-paced, pretty eclectic record that has some considerable highlights. The ass-kicking Rats and Clowns is the closest the Crowes have come to making an AC/DC-ish banger, filled with Chris Robinson oozing defiant attitude. Wilted Rose and Kindred Friend show off how effective and comfortable the band has become in wearing a country rock outfit. Rich Robinson hasn't lost a single iota of his ability to conjure some groovy, twisty riffs on tracks like Follow the Moon and Bleed It Dry. One of the best songs on the album can be described as decadent sludge blues. It's a solid 3.5-star album and worth checking out if you're jonesing for some quality, soulful Southern rock. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Black Crowes, they're in the spirit of you know what you're going to get, and it goes down easy.
Yeah.
That's really what this band is.
The next artist we're going to talk about is the same thing too.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a welcome medicine, and a good call, by the way, on the AC/DC-ness of Rats and Clowns. I was a little bit surprised at that. That's about as riff-tastic as the Crowes get.
Yeah,
And, I'm also a big fan of Wanting and Waiting. I think that's a really, really cool song. I believe that's the single from the record. And also another surprise performance and guest performance by, of all people, Lainey Wilson.
Yeah.
On Wilted Rose. You know, Lainey Wilson, she's a country singer. She's known for being on the show Yellowstone, and she's really she's kind of like the female equivalent of bro country in some respects. But
too bad she couldn't bring Sam Elliott to the recordings.
Yeah. Yeah. So but she shows out on one song on here as well. So good to see that the Crowes are back to making original music. Their last album, I believe it was their last album, wasn't it? Before the Frost.
It was. Well, this is their first album in 14 years. They had another one in 2010. That's why I said.
Oh, okay. Okay, I got you. But they had done some stuff in the late aughts that was really, really fantastic, especially that live record Before the Frost. I would definitely recommend
live. It was new songs recorded live in the studio, basically.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And it was very, very, very good. And this is another strong effort. So it's good to see them coming back. And it's a good things happen when Chris and Rich get along. When they're not trying to beat each other up and they're not trying to piss on each other. Apparently, I mean, there was an article when in some of the research that we did for the Crowes episode, the standalone Crowes episode that we did, where it was their kids that kind of brought them together. Their kids were wondering, like, why can't you two get along, and why don't you guys have any kind of relationship? So it was kind of for the benefit of the kids, and it's like, I think they just realized that the benefit of time, how stupid sibling rivalry can be.
Yeah, exactly.
Easy for me to say as an only child, but from what they tell me, sibling rivalry can be a real thing. So it's good to see them back in the yard. So definitely comes recommended. As does the artist that I'll be talking about. She's kind of a indie world it girl of the moment right now, and deservedly so. We're talking about Waxahatchee and her new album, Tiger's Blood, which I would say is the first great album of 2024 that I've heard to date. It was just released, I believe, last week.
Yeah.
We're recording this on March 29th, so it was released a week ago, and really, really strong album. And it continues the evolution of Waxahatchee. Now, Waxahatchee is a young woman from Alabama named Katie Crutchfield, who's been around for a little more than a decade. This is her sixth studio record.
Hmm.
Her second studio record is one that I strongly recommend that people check out.
It's
Cerulean
her
Salt.
best. Yeah, Cerulean Salt from 2013.
Yeah,
Cerulean Salt. That's her best album to date.
Cerulean Salt. Yeah, that's her best record, and she's done a lot of maturing and a lot of refinement since then. That was a very intimate record, but a very sort of indie, kind of like almost freaky folk kind of record.
I would call her early stuff like a more pained, more tortured Liz Phair.
Yeah, I would say so, and yeah, it has that inherent pop majesty, but it has this intimacy to it that's pretty startling. Now, as she's matured and as she's come into a stronger sense of herself, she's kept that intimacy, but has refined her sound to now become one of the most genuine and warmest of Americana chanteuses in
Yeah,
America.
right.
And Tiger's Blood continues in that vein. Her evolution over the last few years. She's now one of the foremost alt country practitioners in the country. And this album is full of really warm, really romantic, really soulful songs. And one of the things that separates this record from the rest of her catalog is I think there's a discipline to it and a warmth, but she also brings in talk about all country it boys, MJ Lenderman from Asheville, North Carolina. I've covered Lenderman on this podcast before. He made my top 20 list in 2022 with what now would be much higher on my list, Boat Songs. Great record. But she brings him in to play guitar and on one song sing backup. And it's kind of amazing to hear him with the discipline that he kind of plugs into her discipline as a songwriter and as a performer, and to hear him do these brilliantly restrained lead guitar lines through these songs. He plays all the electric guitar on this
Right.
record. She sticks to acoustic guitar, and so really soulful, really warm, really pretty, romantic as hell. Especially there's three singles from this record so far: 365, Bored, and Right Back to It, all three of which are just again romantic as hell and hooky and just really engaging, and she just like brings she makes you fall in love with her in terms of her voice because it has that natural southern twang to it. She's from Alabama, and just formalism and just really just lovely tones to it, and the harmony singing on Right Back to It. Lenderman lends backing vocals there. It's probably going to be the prettiest song I hear in 2024. I don't see anything really exceeding that in terms of its prettiness. So definitely check out this record. Again, it's called Tiger's Blood. It's 12 songs, 42 minutes, which these days is about a perfect length.
Yeah.
Any longer than that, that's still less than 4 minutes a song. I draw the line at 4 minutes a song, man. I'm telling you, my patience for long albums has withered as I've become kind of an old man, and so I think that this is pretty much right in the perfect wheelhouse. And so it's a revelation not only for her still forming maturity, but also for her use of MJ Lenderman as a secret guitar weapon. Great record, uh, really strong, growing on me with the I've listened to it several times and it's still growing on me. I think it'll probably continue to grow on me throughout this year. So check it out. What do you say, Art?
Yeah, no, I agree. This is a really good record. There's not much I can add. What I would say is that basically Katie Crutchfield, she's like comfort food music, you know?
Yep.
You know what you're gonna get, you know it's going to be good. And she's been like this for a while. The Waxahatchee album from 2017 is the only bad one, I think. That's the big heavy rock sound, which
Yeah,
never
yeah.
really suited her songwriting style to
No,
begin
not at
with.
all.
But the country rock groove that she's in now is perfect for her and for what she does. I remember reading an interview with her from Mojo recently, and the songs for this record. they were having a hard time finding out how to record them, because what she had in mind was like, synthesizers and keyboards and have more of an experimental
Yeah,
sound to them.
I,
And they
I could
didn't
see that.
and they didn't sound right. And she was talked into like, you know what? Let's just make it a country rock album like the last one. And guess what? It came out sounding great. So fuck it.
Yeah.
Sometimes sticking to your guns is a good thing. And she does so on this record. And yeah, it's really good, man. This is a very, very solid, very good 4 out of 5 star album.
Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming.
So, and we're going to start our discussion of the year 1969 in our second Golden Age of Rock series. And we're going to start it the way we've been starting it ever since this series started.
Yeah, pretty much.
We got to talk about the Beatles. It always starts with the Beatles.
Yes, we do.
And their final year of 1969 of them being together. By the way, a lot of the material that you're going to hear about, that we're going to talk about, you can find in this great book by Ken McNabb called "And in the End, the Last Days of the Beatles." It's one of the best Beatles books you're ever going to read. And he really goes into in forensic detail what happened in 1969. And you really have to start with the beginning of 1969 and basically the sessions, the failed and then eventually kind of sort of successful sessions for Get Back / Let It Be, of which Peter Jackson made a monster 7.5-hour documentary series on, right, Chris?
Yep. Yeah, indeed. And while we're talking about great books on the Beatles, another one of our source materials for this is Rob Sheffield's book, Dreaming the Beatles, which is a really warm and just whimsical look at the catalog of the Beatles and their history. It's a great concise retelling of the Beatles myth and origin and story as they went along. So that's definitely something that I recommend as well. So anyway, let's talk about the Beatles. The Beatles unofficially came to an end in 1969. Sure, they released an album, Let It Be, in 1970, and did a small bit of recording in that year as well, 70, too. But most of what hit the street that year dated back to January of 1969. The 2021 Peter Jackson assembled documentary Get Back chronicles the not-so-great time had by all putting that music together. A disastrous attempt to rehearse a live performance to be recorded as an album morphed into only slightly less tense recording sessions for a hastily cobbled would-be record the Beatles initially shelved. The documentary shows us George Harrison literally walking out and quitting on the band, and the barely successful subsequent effort to bring him back into the fold in the midst of all the chaos. Sheesh. Now, better, more well-behaved days came later in 1969, when the band entered the studio as a whole entire band, sorta, for the very last time. The end result, Abbey Road, was inarguably a triumph. The one Beatles album that sounds today like it was just made last week. Such was the feat of engineering ingenuity producer George Martin, Paul McCartney, and their collaborators accomplished in the studio that eventually took their masterpiece album's name. The album fakes unity and synergy beautifully. It captures the comings and goings of the individual band members in a way that makes you think they were just as merrily gathered in a room and joyously strumming and bashing away as they were on the set of the Ed Sullivan Show 5+ years earlier. The highlights here are, of course, jaw-dropping. There's McCartney and Ringo stars. They're threatening to steal John Lennon's show on album opener Come Together, an ultra-groovy bopper lathered luxuriously with Lennon's absurdist poetry. There's the 4+1 sensual psychedelic jamming of I Want You, She's So Heavy, another Lennon number that gets instrumentally co-opted, this time by the guesting organist Billy Preston. And then there's that famous McCartney-designed medley of songs on side two. Glorious excerpts, whimsical semi-songs, and not quite crescendoed ballads are attached to each and tail to the only fully realized song in the whole goddamn thing. McCartney's smoothly rendered medley opener, You Never Give Me Your Money. For the record, the whole creation lasts just 15 minutes and 32 seconds, and yet it might as well extend gloriously into infinity. It's that grand. Everyone is made to sound like they're having the times of their lives on Abbey Road. George Harrison out Paul's Paul twice on The Gorgeous Something and on the incredible Here Comes the Sun. Paul pulls off a brilliant Motown impression with Oh Darling, and John's jokey stuff all hits on side two, especially Polythene Pam. Even Ringo earns a victory lap with the wonderful Octopus's Garden, which was probably my dad's favorite silly rock tune and ranks as one of mine, too. Hell, it's all such a joy that even McCartney's dopey, creepy murder ditty, Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which everyone but Paul absolutely hated,
Yep.
is totally excusable. And in the end, it all ended with a song called The End and the goofy throwaway Her Majesty. But was Abbey Road the real end of the Beatles? Maybe. Probably even. Though technically it wasn't. I will let author Rob Sheffield, the author of that book I mentioned, Dreaming the Beatles, contextualize this mystifying matter better than I ever could. Quoting Sheffield now. Quote, so let's put it this way. Let It Be is the final Beatle album, not Abbey Road. Only if it counts as a Beatle album. Can you argue that Let It Be is a Beatle album, yet not the Beatles' final album? No, not really, because it includes a tiny amount of music they made in 1970. So here's my reluctant conclusion. I like Abbey Road better. Sentimentally, it's the one I think of as the end. However, unfortunately, Let It Be is the Beatles' last album. Trust me, we will keep arguing about that. It's what we do, and if there's no way to settle the debate over where the Beatle canon ends, that's ultimately because there's no ending at all. End quote. Arturo, what do you say?
What do I say? Okay, first let me talk about the Peter Jackson session, the Peter Jackson documentary series. And forget it. The sessions were originally called. The album was going to be called Get Back.
Get Back, yeah.
Yeah, it was laid the following year when they called the album Let It Be, because the single Let It Be had become a big hit. But anyway, if you ever wanted to know who the real leader of the Beatles was, the Peter Jackson documentary series proves that it's John Lennon, and it was John Lennon.
Yeah.
Listen, it was Paul McCartney's idea, his harebrained idea to do this. Oh, let's have a film crew record us while we're writing, film us while we're writing and recording songs. Nobody was happy about it. Nobody liked it. George Martin himself didn't think it was a good idea, and it really was disastrous. Harrison temporarily left the band. And this is how you know Lennon was the leader. During the Twickenham Studios part of the documentary series, when everything is going to shit, that's where John Lennon is kind of checked out. He's probably high on heroin half of the time. He's not really active. He's not really engaged. He's not that vocal. And Paul McCartney is trying to run the ship, and nobody wants to follow Paul because everyone's pissed off at Paul because this stupid bullshit plan was Paul's idea in the first place. Okay.
And then you have a crazy director who's trying to convince them to all go to Libya.
Right. I know.
Yeah.
Well, then they go back. They end the Twickenham stuff. First of all, Harrison leaves, and it's John Lennon who brings him back to the fold. They mentioned that in the documentary series. It's John and Yoko who visit George's home, and they talk George into coming back. Okay, so he does come back. Proceedings move to a proper studio, the Beatles' regular studio, where they record all their stuff. And guess what? John Lennon shows up with his hair all washed. He's more active, he's more lucid, he's more engaged, and all of a sudden, all the other band members fall in line, including Paul McCartney. There's a great scene, blink and you'll miss it. It's toward the side of the camera. If you're watching it on your screen, it's on the right side. The two of them, John and Paul, just talking, murmuring amongst each other. Lennon is talking to him about something, saying what to do about something, and you hear McCartney say, "Okay, you're the boss." And he's not saying it ironically. He's not saying it sarcastically. You can tell by the tone that it's
Yep.
sincere. So this is the impact Lennon had on the Beatles as a leader. He was the leader of that band,
Yeah.
and even Paul McCartney has hinted at that amongst all his quotes of trying to take credit for everything all the other Beatles ever did, which is what he does now in his old age. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's the point. Now we go to Abbey Road. My thoughts on Abbey Road. Well, there's a category of albums that I admit are 5-star classics, and but they are overrated 5-star classics.
Bullshit.
And I think Abbey Road is one of them. I think Abbey Road is a great record, but it's also a very flawed record in a lot of ways. Neither Lennon nor McCartney were firing on all cylinders as songwriters at this point. I mean, the second half of the album kind of proves it. They didn't have enough full songs. They had to make this giant suite of a sweet patchwork of whatever little snippets of songs they had. Lennon and his humor songs, Sun King, Mean Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam. Paul McCartney had like little patchworks of songs there. She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, which is never completed. Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight, All That Way. Yeah, those aren't completed songs. They're like parts of songs. So neither of these guys were really firing on all cylinders. And the chinks in McCartney's songwriting armor was already showing by the White Album. You can hear it in that horrible, god-awful Maxwell Silver Hammer, a song so bad that all three other Beatles and George Martin hated.
Yeah.
But even then, I mean, I'm not a fan of Octopus's Garden. It's proof that Ringo should never
come
write
on.
songs. Ringo,
come on.
Ringo's not a writer.
Octopus's Garden is wonderful.
No, it's crap. I'm not a huge fan of the second half of the album because of all that. I'm not impressed by the suite. To me, they're just incomplete songs patched together because the two leaders of the band didn't have enough. But you are right about George Harrison. He was firing on all cylinders with Something and Here Comes the Sun and all the songs that would become All Things Must Pass. In retrospect, they probably should have allowed some more of George's songs on this record. Lennon already had one foot out the door by the time of Abbey Road, but he does contribute, I think, 2 of the 4 best songs on the whole album. Come Together. Yeah, McCartney's bass groove is awesome, but this is a John Lennon song through and through. Lyrically, musically, attitude-wise, this is a John song. And of course, I Want You, She's So Heavy. You talk about Billy Preston's organ. What impresses me most about this song is Lennon's guitar and Lennon's voice. His vocal performance is earth-shattering on this record. McCartney's great in Oh Darling. Don't get me wrong. He's awesome. His vocal performance kicks ass in that song. But I think Lennon outdoes him in I Want You, She's So Heavy. This is not a rock song. This is proto-sludge metal. This is grunge.
In some ways. Yeah.
This song is the birth of Alice in Chains. This is just grunge in gestation. That's how far ahead the Beatles, and in particular Lennon, was at this time, at this point in their career. Lennon will go on to his first 2 solo albums are masterpieces. They would follow Abbey Road.
So then, can we say that Come Together is the birth of Aerosmith?
They covered Come Together.
I know. I'm kind of fucking around, but that does kind of set the template for Aerosmith, though, doesn't it?
I would say Come Together is the Beatles' attempt to try and do a Creedence Clearwater revival kind of song, actually.
Yeah, could be. Could be.
Because it's very swampy. It's got that swamp groove to it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, Abbey Road, great album, 5-star classic. I think not the 1970 version of Let It Be is better. The 2003 Let It Be Naked version.
Oh, yeah.
That's the version of Let It Be.
That's way better.
That's the one that I go to because they strip away all of Phil Spector's production and his string arrangements that McCartney despised. And I don't think Lennon liked it much either. And they strip away the production. They digitally remaster the tracks. Okay. Mm-hmm. And they put it in different running order, the order that the Beatles intended, starting off with McCartney's Get Back.
Yeah, and they actually put Don't Bring Me Down on the record too.
Exactly. They put Don't Bring Me Down on the record, which is a great Lennon song. And also and most importantly, they strip away the string arrangements from the Lennon
Acro-
song
across the universe.
across. I keep forgetting that name. Yeah. Yes, across the universe, and they take away, which is one of Lennon's best, and they take away the string arrangements for the long and winding road. Unfortunately, you can't really polish much of a turd. That's one of McCartney's worst songs ever. You
Okay.
know, I
Yeah.
mean, they could talk about trite, sentimental, and boring. That is that song. It's awful. It's more long-winded than like the worst of Frank Sinatra. And
Yeah.
to take away the string arrangements, it's just a freaking bland piano ballad. But it's the only bad track. It tells you how weak McCartney was getting at this point. But it's the only bad track on Let It Be Naked, the one that all of you should hear and check out.
Yeah.
Much better sounding, much better arranged, much better
Yeah.
running order than the original 1970 release.
But I will say, I mean, you can debate the exact order or how it all went down or all that, but the end chapter of the Beatles is really just fascinating. And so,
Yeah.
all the stuff that they did in '69 and all the stuff that they were juggling and the output that they came up with was just fantastic. And just and as a piece of craftsmanship, I mean, Abbey Road is just absolutely unmatched. I mean, yeah, you talked about all those like half songs, but they did a really, really great job of disguising. You know,
Yeah.
one man's thin songbook is another one's beautiful, fluid, flourishing medley.
Yeah.
And they pull it a neat trick. It's only 15 minutes and 32 seconds.
Abbey Road could have used John Lennon's Cold Turkey. The song, it's a really heavy rock song. It's about him
Yeah,
getting off of heroin, and he submitted it for Abbey Road. The
yeah, he
others didn't
did.
want they didn't want another drug song on there because there were a couple of them already on the White Album, and the Beatles wanted to get that attention away from them. And I
Yeah,
understand, understandably so. However, I think Cold Turkey would have made Abbey Road stronger.
yeah. I think you're probably right about that.
It definitely should have replaced Maxwell's Silver Hammer.
Oh, come on, Maxwell Silver. I mean, it's got its charms. I mean, as a creepy little ditty, it has its place. It's definitely the bottom of the barrel, but still, I think it's a perfect album, and I think that it's one of the best albums ever made, and it really sets a tone for 1969. However, possibly not as much of a tone for 1969 as the next record that we're going to talk about, right, Art?
Oh, this next record is way, way better than Abbey Road. I'm sorry. And I'll argue anyone to the death, and they're wrong. And I'll prove them to be wrong. We're going to talk about the Rolling Stones and their year of 1969 and the year they put out the best album of 1969, the dirty, gritty blues, gospel, country, folk rock hybrid masterpiece, Let It Bleed. Let's begin. The Rolling Stones entered 1969 on an all-time high after the critical and commercial success of Jumpin' Jack Flash, the single, and the classic album Beggar's Banquet. However, changes were on the horizon. The drug problems of guitarist and founding member Brian Jones got too much to bear for the band, with his unreliability and sheer inability to contribute getting worse by the month. After a drug arrest the previous year meant that he couldn't get a work visa for a scheduled US tour in July, the band decided to fire him in June and bring in a new guitarist. This unfortunately postponed the release of their new album by a few months and forced them to reschedule the US tour for November. The sad news is that 1 month later, Jones was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool. The official police story is that he died of quote unquote death by misadventure. There have been numerous and pervasive rumors throughout the years that he was actually murdered, but that's another story or fodder for another podcast episode. Eh,
Oh, there you
Chris?
go. Yeah, hey, yeah, true crime.
True crime.
The Curmudgeon Rock Report covers true crime.
Yeah, Brian Jones will be our first episode in that series. Anyway,
Yeah,
the good news is that the guy they brought in to replace him was the brilliant young virtuoso Mick Taylor, not only a much better guitarist than Jones, but quite possibly the best guitarist the Stones ever employed. It didn't take long for Taylor to be accommodated into the band, as in that June, the new lineup of the Rolling Stones went into the studio to record one of the greatest and most iconic songs in their entire catalog. If you think you haven't heard Honky Tonk Women, yes, you have. It doesn't open with a guitar riff, as most Stones songs do, but with a timelessly distinctive cowbell beat by producer Jimmy Miller. What follows is a slab of sweaty, sleazy, loose, swinging, country-flavored blues rock that finds Mick Jagger salaciously singing about hooking up with a dancing girl at a country and western bar in Memphis. Released just 1 month later in July, it hit #1 in both the US and the UK and the top 5 everywhere else in the world. The album that was supposed to accompany Honky Tonk Women was, as I said earlier, supposed to come out at the same time as the single, and it was mostly done, but Brian Jones's firing and the postponement of the US tour delayed its release. It's a good thing that happened, though, because the extra work the band put into in the album for the rest of the year resulted in its December 1969 release, and that resulted in not just one of the single greatest rock and roll recordings of all time, but one of the greatest albums of all time, period. This thing called rock and roll is a mutt hybrid of several styles: blues, rhythm and blues, folk, country music, and gospel, all combined to give the genre its basic DNA, creating a body of work, or just an album, that incorporates and touches upon all these flavors of American roots music that basically culminate in rock and roll, is an endeavor many artists and bands had tried before the Rolling Stones. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Ray Charles, Solomon Burke, Otis Redding, Ike and Tina Turner, Bob Dylan, the Byrds, the band. You get it. You get the gist.
That narrows it down.
The list is endless. Yet,
Yeah.
not a single band or artist, American or British, white or black, has ever performed such an endeavor as effectively, or as convincingly, or as powerfully, or as authentically, as comprehensively, and as boldly as the Rolling Stones did with Let It Bleed. The Stones touched on every single strand of American roots music and tied it all together with a masterclass of pop songwriting and lyricism. Yes, lyricism that ranged from the sacred to the profane, from the sublime to the sordid, from the poetic to the romantic, from the joyful to the dreadful. And most impressively of all, they did all this while breaking new sonic ground and giving roots rock a heaviness that could compete with the emerging likes of Led Zeppelin and the new direction of The Who. The chilling, foreboding menace of opening track Gimme Shelter, with its ominous riff and thundering groove, finds Jagger and backup singer Mary Clayton, warning us that war, children, is just a shout away. Their spacious, tortured version of the old blues master Robert Johnson's Love in Vain is actually better and more soulful than the original. The Appalachian Mountains are evoked with a down-home hootenanny version of honky tonk blues called Honky Tonk, country honk, I should say, complete with Byron Berline, I think it's Berline, Byron Berline recording his violin track on the pavement outside the studio for extra ambiance. Live With Me is one of the Stones' flat-out raunchiest tracks, replete with a sweaty R&B groove and a Charlie Watts beat so driving it could make you ejaculate. The title track is one of the greatest examples ever of Watts's thoroughly unique approach to drumming, hanging a step behind the beat, letting the rhythm guitar lead the beat, creating a loose, swinging rhythm that makes the track danceable. It's basically stoner country, the song Let It Bleed, with Jagger utilizing a slacker drawl to brilliantly mix sex and drug references as a plea for emotional dependence. Midnight Rambler is what Keith Richards famously called a blues opera, a suite complete with multiple sections that vary in tempo and time signatures, and somehow climaxes in feverish intensity. You Got the Silver is one of the Stones' most touching and beautiful country ballads. Keith Richards is a swooning peon to his newborn son. Monkey Man predicts the funk rock hybrid of Funkadelic by 1 year and has one of the nastiest, most evil riffs Richards ever concocted. The album ends with another gospel number, like Beggar's Banquet did, but this one, You Can't Always Get What You Want, is even better, with an actual choir, the London Bach choir, exact, harmonizing throughout. The groove is funkier and more freewheeling. The chorus is catchier and more uplifting. And the outro is more epic than the final track on Beggar's Banquet, Salt of the Earth. Is it Salt of the Earth?
Salt of the Earth, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
It is
You have
it
to
is salt of the earth.
edit that one. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, the lyrics have always been a subject of debate. For you can't always get what you want, but Jagger himself has said that the lyrics are about the drug scene in London's Chelsea area and how the song is supposed to convey the end of a previously idyllic era. It's a testament to Jagger's growing skill as a lyricist that what he called, quote, a doomy ballad is given an uplifting quality by a simple turn of a phrase. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you just might find you'll get what you need. For as stunning as this record is, the Rolling Stones would actually surpass this and outdo themselves a few years later. But that's another story for another installment in this second Golden Age of Rock series.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
now, for now, let's just marvel at the sheer brilliance and stroke of genius that this band, that was once considered runners up to the Beatles, actually concocted. Of all the amazing and timelessly classic and deeply influential albums that came out in 1969, Let It Bleed is this curmudgeon's pick as the #1 album of the whole lot. Chris?
Yeah, I'd still put Abbey Road ahead of it, but that's just me,
Bullshit.
and that's just my preferences. But no, this album's amazing. I mean, again, come on, that's kind of like comparing gold and platinum. I mean, you're still doing pretty damn good, either which way. Uh, this album was Keith Richards' finest moment for the Stones. He is
Because
the
he played
dominant.
guitar on almost all of it.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. There's the thing about it is he kind of had
Yeah.
to step up because he didn't have Brian Jones, and as far as I know, Mick Taylor only shows up. I want to say he plays on Country Honk, and he might have shown up on Live with Me, but he's barely on the record.
Yeah.
And so Keith Richards is there having to hold down the show, and he does it brilliantly. And there's a he's at his swaggering best. I mean, the quality of the riffing, the tones of his guitar, the uh the diversity of the songwriting and of the playing styles, from the blues and the country and the cover of Love in Vain and just what he does there. And even like you've got the silver, uh, would I've never been much of a Richards fan as far as him doing the singing, but that's
Right.
actually one of his better volleys as a Stone, and so that really is his finest hour. And you're right. I mean, as an exploration of the American vernacular, it's on a par in terms of the accomplishment of it and what it uncovers about American music. It's on a par with Exile on Main Street, which came out 3 years later.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
the songs aren't collectively the songs aren't as strong. Yeah, which says something about Exile on Main Street. But I think that the exercise it started on Beggar's Banquet, and then they take it up several more notches on Let It Bleed. And you described it right. It really is a hybrid of all of those genres that you talked about, and it just comes out. And you used the word concocted twice in your. It,
Yes.
it was a really concocted record, man. But that's an appropriate word to use. It is a concoction of an album, and it's a brilliant concoction of all of that. And so uh, definitely worth celebrating. I think that Jagger as well as a lyricist. I mean, just there's some dark shit on this record, like
Yeah.
between the Midnight Rambler and then like Let It Bleed, which is just, I mean, that's just dirty. And he's in his still what he's like, and still in his 20s at the time, and
Yeah.
that's like dirty old man shit right there. Look, he's 27 singing a dirty old man song. So,
Oh, for the record, Chris, Mick Taylor on this album plays on only 2 songs. He does the slide guitar on Country Hunk, and he plays electric guitar on Live with Me. That
yeah,
they basically is in the studio jam, basically.
yeah. So I was right. Yep,
So you were right. All the other guitars on this record are Keith.
yep. And that's the thing. It's pretty extraordinary. So, yeah, those are my thoughts about Let It Bleed. Magnificent record, magnificent accomplishment, and it just shows how much of a genius Keith Richard is. I mean, he's kind of the butt of jokes is the fact that the guy's still alive and he was on more drugs than probably a property room in Chicago. But man, the guy was a genius, and we
Yeah.
we should celebrate him always. And Let It Bleed is Exhibit 2 as to why we should celebrate him. Exhibit 1 came out 3 years later, but this is Exhibit 2 as to why we should celebrate Keith Richards as an all-time genius.
All right. Next, we talked about the Beatles, we talked about the Stones. Now we're going to talk about the Who and their timeless classic, amazing, all-time great album that also came out in 1969. And my love of this album has only grown as the years have passed.
Yeah, mine too.
I adore, well, I adore Tommy. Chris, tell us
Yes,
about Tommy.
I adore Tommy as well. A pretty good year for albums, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't really talk about the Beatles and the Stones by this point, but without talking about the Who. And '69 was sort of their that was the year that they officially joined those two on stage A and
Yeah.
became a superstar band. So we have to talk about the Who and Tommy. For me, the only band in all of rock and roll as meaningful as the Beatles is the Who. Hell, the Who might even be more meaningful. Not because they were a better band necessarily. I mean, no one can objectively say that Tommy is a better album than Abbey Road or Sergeant
I
Pepper's
will.
Revolver. I don't think. And yet, Tommy is probably the greatest accomplishment of that whole bunch. It really is. It's one of the most extraordinary accomplishments in rock and roll history. Pete Townshend's magnum opus infused a new level of ambition into rock and roll and showed that a conceptual depth bordering on transcendence was actually possible. There's no other superstar making rock album quite like it. It effectively put The Who on the A list in 1969, propelling them to the stage of Woodstock and beyond. Tommy, of course, is famously referred to as a rock opera. Indeed, it comes fully equipped with an overture, an underture, extraordinary motifs, and characters whose motivations and feelings are sung out in full glory. The album tells the satirical yet profound story of a deaf, dumb, and blind kid who survives horrific abuses and finds his salvation, his purpose, and ultimately his very own messianic movement through the game of pinball. To listen to Tommy is to experience it. Who cares if it's generally a badly produced record? It works because because it's got heartfelt craft, and that craft is just so overwhelming. Townsend and his bandmates had been building to their Tommy breakout for several years, of course. The Who's 9-minute mini opera, A Quick One, While He's Away, a tale of infidelity and forgiveness rocked out in 6 movements, dates all the way back to 1966. I don't think people realize I think a lot of people know A Quick One, but I don't think they realize that that goes all the way back to 1966.
Yeah.
Their album prior to Tommy, which was 1967's The Who's Sell Out, dabbled in satire as well, mixing faux TV-style jingles in with the standard rockers. And even in earlier pop hits like My Generation and I Can See for Miles, Townshend profiled as a guy with a hell of a lot to say under that gawky veneer. But I'm sure no one could have imagined that a Tommy was lurking within Townshend's soul. Wow. The band toured behind Tommy for 2 years, playing the opera in its entirety night after night, which helped foment the Who's reputation as perhaps the greatest live band in all of rock and roll. The quintessential version of Tommy, by the way, can be found on the super duper deluxe edition of 1970's Live at Leeds.
I agree with that.
Which in each and every iteration is probably the greatest live album ever made. Seek that out immediately after you get done listening to us. It's mighty as hell, I promise, that rendition of Tommy. Now, Tommy the album was an immediate hit in both the UK and the US. It reached number 2 on the UK albums chart and actually reached number 7. It debuted at number 7 on the US chart. In the US, it took only 3 months for the album to reach gold album status. And gold albums are rewarded by the Recording Industry Association of America for shipments of 500,000 plus units. The album set the tone for the rest of the Who's run as a band. Townshend tried to outdo himself not once, but twice. The first of those efforts, Lifehouse, was aborted amid protestations from his bandmates and producers. Remnants of Lifehouse hit the shelves as Who's Next in 1971.
Their greatest album.
Yes, ironically enough, their greatest album. Townshend was more successfully operatic in 1973, completing and releasing Quadrophenia, which chronicles the early adulthood crisis of an aging mod in England. That album has highs that rival and maybe even surpass those of Tommy, but it's also nowhere near as consistent or coherent. Subsequent Who albums were made self consciously with the obvious undertones that the band was now operating in the shadow of their own artistic high point. Yep, Tommy was certainly lightning in a bottle and then some. It could not be replicated by The Who or by anyone else. And here, 55 years later, I can say confidently that it never will be by anybody ever, ever, ever. What a singular achievement. Arturo, what say you?
Yeah, I disagree with the notion that it's poorly produced. I love the acoustic textures on Tommy. You know, it doesn't rock as hard as the Live at Leeds or any of their live renditions of Tommy.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
that's what I mean by poor production. It loses the power. I mean,
yeah,
is it engineered okay, fine, but you don't get the power, and you don't get
yeah.
you don't get the depth, and you
But
don't.
then again, nothing was as good as the Who live.
Wow, that's
Nobody.
true. That's true.
You know,
Yeah,
the Who live in 1969, 1970 were a fucking force of nature.
no shit.
Nobody could compete with them. Nobody. You know,
Yeah,
maybe maybe Led Zeppelin right off the gate, maybe. And I love the Stones as a live band. They couldn't compete with the Who. So yeah, you know, it's not. I don't think it's fair to compare the studio version of Tommy to the live version because there's nothing like peak live Who, nothing like it.
right.
They are arguably the greatest live band in the history of rock, you know. So I think the Who's Tommy, the studio album version of Tommy should be judged by itself. And by itself, it's a wonderfully produced, but like you said, more importantly, more wonderfully composed, written, and just more coherent and
Arranged.
more consistent and arranged really, really well. There's a depth and a breadth to Tommy, not just musically, but lyrically as well. So yeah, it's an album
And it's
that
moving as hell. It's
it's
legitimately
very
moving as
moving.
hell. It's one of the few rock albums that can move me to tears.
Yeah, it's a very moving record, you know. So I really think for those of you, yeah, okay, go check out the Who's live at Leeds. You'll be blown away. You may not want to listen to anything else by the Who,
Yeah.
understandably so, because you can't beat live at Leeds. But really check out and try and listen to Tommy on its own, the studio album on its own, to just really revel in the wonder of that record.
Yeah, absolutely. And wonder really captures it because there is a wonder, and it's strange because it gets into these kind of weird territory with all the pinball stuff in the second half
Yeah,
of the record, but there's a universality to it.
right.
I mean, obviously it's kind of lampooning the Christ story
Mhm.
in a way
Right.
that mirrors Townsend's own story. I mean, that there's an autobiographical connection to what he's talking about on the album as for in terms of the abuse and
Mm.
in terms of just sort of the feeling outcast growing up. But that's what I'm saying. It's so weirdly specific and so odd, but at the same time just so universal, and it's just an amazing accomplishment for them to do that. I mean, I've always been a huge fan of the song Christmas
Yeah,
because again, it just talking about shared experience, and then in the midst of that, you get you get the awakening with "See Me, Feel Me," or
yeah.
touch me, feel me" coming in the middle of that. It's pretty extraordinary. There really is just nothing else like Tommy. It's just singular, and I love it, love it, love it, love it. I also love the bands that you're going to be talking about here next, Art.
Yes, Led Zeppelin and the Stooges. Why am I putting them together? You'll see why.
Yep.
Now, the 1960s through the 1970s will forever be known as rock's formative years, the era when it spread its wings and sprouted into not just a commercial behemoth, but an artistic force as one of the two or three dominant musical genres of the 20th century. Tons of subgenres emerged during this time: folk rock, country rock, blues rock, psychedelic rock, you name it. But of all the rock subgenres born in this time that resonated the most throughout the years and wielded the most influence and impact for future generations of fans and artists and informing future subgenres, it's hard to argue against heavy metal and punk. In 1969, two bands released debut albums, one of them releasing their first two, that set the stage for these respective subgenres for their development in the next decade. The foundation for heavy metal was arguably already set by Cream and Jimi Hendrix, but when Led Zeppelin came around, the subgenre came one step closer to having its definable sound, attitude, and aesthetic, opening the door 1 year later for another band to come through and actualize themselves as the first heavy metal band. More on that band in the next installment of the Second Golden Age of Rock series.
Oh, yeah.
As we covered in our 1965 installment of our Second Golden Age of Rock series, The Who and the various garage rock bands in the US had already set the template for what would become known as punk. But when Iggy Pop and his gang of misfits arrived in 1969, that subgenre came one step closer to having its definable sound, attitude, and aesthetic established with the Stooges' self-titled debut album. Aside from musical style, the biggest thing that separated Zeppelin from the Stooges was commercial success. Led Zeppelin instantly became superstars, and within 2 years, they were outselling the Beatles, all the solo Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who. In their wake came Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, AC/DC, Motorhead, Iron Maiden, onward to the new wave of British heavy metal that itself became a touchstone for the thrash metal scene of the 1980s, spearheaded by Metallica, onward to grunge, to goth metal, to alternative metal, and beyond. Led Zeppelin's fingerprints are on all of them, and in many different ways too. That level of success evaded the Stooges, the commercial success, that is. Nevertheless, the Stooges' impact cannot and should not be measured by record sales. Like the Velvet Underground before them, it can be said that everyone who bought a Stooges record went to form a band themselves, and the lineation from the Stooges to punk rock is a lot clearer and more obvious than that of the Velvets to punk. It is possible to overestimate, well, it's impossible really to overestimate how much of an influential touchstone the Stooges were to the underground development of punk in both the US and the UK throughout the 1970s, leading up to punk's commercial explosion in the UK in 1976, the rise of the small but transcendently important New York CBGB scene in the mid-1970s, extending to the monumental explosion of the American indie alternative underground in the 1980s, and seeing its fruition with punk's arrival in the mainstream in the 1990s. Yes, Iggy and the Stooges were that much of a guiding light. None other than Kurt Cobain himself ranked the Stooges' 1973 album Raw Power as his #1 all-time favorite album. Enough said. But let's start with Led Zeppelin. For all their reputation consisting of Jimmy Page's chunky, meaty riffs, John Bonham's loud as bombs sledgehammer drums, and Robert Plant's screeching banshee vocals, much, if not most, of Zeppelin's music can and probably should be categorized by its eclecticism, its stylistic variety, its attention to sonic detail with its rich textures, and the overall sense of space in the music, something that gave the best Zeppelin records their eerie atmosphere and their ambiance. All these are already well established and firmly in place with their self-titled debut album. Sure, you have proto-metal barn burners like Good Times, Bad Times, and the hard-charging proto-punk of Communication Breakdown, but it would be foolish, as many critics of the time did, to label Led Zeppelin as meat-headed practitioners of simplistic cock rock. Aside from the deep blues influence, folk music in its many varieties and styles pop up all over this record. Folk singer Anne Breeden's gorgeous ballad, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, is given a powerful, epic, bashing treatment, made all the more impressive with the fact that there are no electric guitars in sight, while also maintaining the original's eloquent, haunting beauty. Dazed and Confused, originally a dark, sparse, tortured song by Californian folk singer David Holmes is reworked by Jimmy Page into a monster-sized behemoth of what can now be called psychedelic grunge, maybe even a precursor to doom metal with its horror movie riff. The song's shifts from groaning grind to bash out power rock were a platform for the band to expand and improvise when they performed it live, and remains to this day one of Led Zeppelin's most iconic tracks. Even traditional instrumental Irish folk music is given a turn as Page takes or copies British folk musician Bert Jansch's reading of the traditional song Down by Black Waterside and gives it
Yeah.
an Indian flavor, incorporating percussion via the traditional Indian instrument known as the tabla. The blues covers are phenomenal as
Oh yeah.
well, with two Willie Dixon songs, You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You, Baby, being imbued with the by now patented Zeppelin formula of heaviness, space, and dark mood. How Many
Yeah.
More Times, credited to Page and Plant, Robert Plant, is actually a hodgepodge of different blues covers. The song
Yeah.
title and Plant's vocals are taken almost verbatim from the Howlin' Wolf song, How Many More Years, while the vamp in the second half of the song, where Page goes on about, or Plant goes on about Rosie and the hunter, that comes from an older Albert King song. Despite the obvious theft, of which Zeppelin were especially guilty of in this early part of their career, the track is a watershed moment in the history of rock music where you can actually hear heavy blues rock morphing into heavy metal in real time.
Hmm.
Clapton and not even the great Jimi Hendrix got this heavy. One of the most important and influential albums of all time by any band in any genre. It is absolutely in the running, I'd say in a group of five, for greatest debut albums of all time. Before we move on to Led Zeppelin 2, I know, Chris, you have Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction as the greatest debut album ever. You're
Yep.
wrong. This one is better. But anyway, give some love to Zepp 1, Chris.
I can give love to Zeppelin. I Can't Quit You, Baby is just was always kind of been my favorite song on that record because it's just indicative of that heaviness. And we have to talk about John Paul Jones as a bassist
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
That he was in some ways he was their secret weapon. That he just grounds all of it and just the he just anchors things in a heaviness that when everything surges, when they go soft like that, and his bass is what is lurking, it grounds it in a heaviness so that when it soars again, it just explodes. And
yeah.
it's like that on that whole record. There's just it's a propulsive record, and it's raw. I mean, I it's definitely I think it's the rawest of their records, for sure, and just always been blown away by it. I mean, and obviously can't beat Dazed and Confused.
Yeah.
You can't beat it. I mean, the whole thing with the playing the guitar like the violin. Uh, Yikes, man! That is just mind blowing shit.
Jimmy Page is doing that with the Yardbirds when he was in the Yardbirds. He just brought it
Yeah,
over to Led Zeppelin.
yeah,
Anyway, yeah. So let's go move on. Led Zeppelin 2. Now, Led
yeah.
Zeppelin had two albums this year. Such was the momentum from the enormous fan response and commercial success of Led Zeppelin's first album that when Led Zeppelin 2 emerged in October 1969, it shot to number one on both sides of the Atlantic, overtaking the Beatles' Abbey Road for the top spot. There's a nervous, edgy, super aggressive feeling to this record.
Oh yeah,
In fact, such is the heaviness of the album, which such is its narrow focus on mind-blowing intensity, that one can successfully argue that this is maybe the first true heavy metal album and the actual blueprint for other bands who would call themselves heavy metal to follow. There's a reason for the album's feverish intensity. The whole record was recorded in a touch and go manner at various studios throughout the US during the marathon touring they were doing for their first album. All the songs were worked out during sound checks and actual live performances. So when Led Zeppelin entered these various American studios, they were hot off the road and ready to rumble. You can hear it in the speed break of Lemon Song, the band's reworking of bluesman Chester Burnett's it was a Chester Burnett song, and Chester Burnett and Howlin' Wolf together. They also did a Killing Floor, those two, and that's the basis for Lemon Song. And Lemon Song also incorporates lyrics from Robert Johnson's Traveling Riverside Blues. But those appropriations don't matter. What matters is the sheer power that this song brings. John Bonham's madman drumming, Jimmy Page's blistering lead guitar runs. It runs the gamut, and it presages Eddie Van Halen. And then you have Robert Plant's hormonal wails and moans, something every heavy metal singer in the future would ape, but never successfully so.
Nope.
The song Whole Lotta Love became a worldwide top 10 hit, giving Zeppelin one of their signature songs. But the song really all comes down to that riff. If
Yeah.
anything, aside from casting the heavy metal template in iron, this album introduced Page's innovative notion of guitar riff as the hook of the entire song.
Yep.
Many bands would follow down this path through
many,
the
many,
1970s.
many, many, many,
Yeah.
many bands.
Many. Almost all of them through
Yes.
the 1970s and beyond. Willie Dixon was one of the blues most important and greatest songwriters of other people's material. And aside from writing for Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters, he wrote the immortal classic Bring It On Home for Sonny Boy Williamson. Page and Plant reworked it to one of the greatest, most spitfire album finales in rock history, with one of Page's most incendiary riffs. Unfortunately, they didn't originally credit Dixon for the song on the album's liner notes.
Nope.
Dixon sued, and the band settled out of court with a cash settlement, putting Dixon's name on the credits on future reissues of Led Zeppelin 2. What's next? The orgiastic riffarama of Heartbreaker, segueing into Living Loving Maid. The brontosaurus rock of Moby Dick, replete with John Bonham's epic virtuoso drum solo. The gorgeous acoustic electric guitar texture dynamics of Ramble On. All of that. Led Zeppelin 2 is the sound of the band coming into their own, fulfilling their potential as Atlantic Records hoped they would as the successors to Cream, commercially conquering the world, lighting the candle for heavy metal and showing the way for and establishing the standard for what rock and roll would sound like for the rest of the decade and beyond. If you don't have this as one of the 50 greatest albums of all time, your taste in music is terminally fucked up.
Yes, that I will concur with. I think that the birth of the heavy metal hippie is found with Led Zeppelin 2, because it is a swinging happening, man. It is just definitely one of the 50 best albums ever. And here's the funny thing, I discovered Zeppelin when I was 16 years old through the Led Zeppelin box set. Which was 4 discs, and really one of the greatest box sets of the era and probably ever released. But 7 of the 9 songs from Led Zeppelin 2 are in that 4 CD box set. The 2 that don't make it turn out to be my favorite songs on the album, and that's the Lemon Song and Bring It On Home. Both of which are just awesome, just swagger, just balls out, brilliant. Just the intensity and just the pure rockness of those songs is just great.
Pure rockness.
There's just pure rockness to both those songs, especially the end of the Lemon Song, where they steal that Robert Johnson lyric, the squeeze the lemon till the juice runs down my leg.
I wonder what that's about.
I have no idea, baby. I have no idea. That they're so vague in their lyrics. They're so artistic, that they need to be more opaque. No idea. But anyway, one of the best albums, and I do actually count this as the first heavy metal album. You can make the argument that it's between this and the Black Sabbath albums of the next year, but I think it starts here, and I would put this as the first and one of the 5 best heavy metal albums.
Okay. Well, this little section about punk and metal being birthed in 1969, we got to give a little love to the punk now. With modern ears attuned to what rock music became, one can be forgiven for wondering why the Stooges' self-titled debut didn't take off and become a bestseller. If you listen to it now, it sounds awesome. But if you implement a little historical perspective into your thinking as anyone must when they're looking back and analyzing music of the past. It's easy to see why. Unlike Led Zeppelin or The Who, the Stooges didn't have gargantuan riffs that hit you over the head into submission, nor macho lead singers who like to swing their chests and their long curly locks. Unlike the Rolling Stones or the Doors, they didn't have these dreamboat, impossibly good-looking frontman backed by bands making instantly accessible rock music couched in perfectly crafted pop songs. In fact, the Stooges were a mongrel band
Yeah,
of
they were a bunch of
genuinely,
mongrels from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
right, a mongrel band of genuinely reprobate misfits and outsiders from the college town of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Like you said, neither of them with enough family money or a substantial educational background to get into a community college, much less a university like the University of Michigan. They were lower middle class kids, some of whom, like Iggy, who even grew up in a trailer park. And they grew up, two of the guys in the Stooges grew up in trailer parks.
Yep.
And their nasty, edgy, confrontational, uncompromising brand of angry garage rock reflected their dark, disaffected, angry souls, just as much as the primitive nature of their music was almost a badge of honor, reflecting their socioeconomic status. In fact, it makes you wonder what Jack Holtzman, the head of Elektra Records, was thinking when he signed the Stooges and assigned John Cale, the recently fired multi-instrumentalist from the equally uncompromising band The Velvet Underground, to produce their self-titled debut album.
John Cale. That's always one of the more amazing mismatches in the history of rock and roll.
Yes, this will work. Well, you know what? It did. Because the key word here is primitive. The Stooges' raw, ferocious sound was primitive, more intentionally minimalist than simplistic. And like I said earlier, it had a profound long-term influence on what would become called punk rock less than a decade later, I should say, best exemplified by bands like the New York Dolls, the Ramones, and the Sex Pistols, and so on and so on. But make no mistake, what the Stooges were concocting, there's that word again, what they were concocting here seriously blurred the lines between proto-punk, i.e. what those mid-60s US garage bands and The Who were doing, and actual punk. You can hear it in the savage, blood-curdling, Bo Diddley rhythms of the song 1969, where Scott Ashton's guitar is put through a wah-wah pedal, and it sounds like the wah-wah pedal's being smashed with a hammer, giving the track this white noise onslaught, not unlike what the Velvet Underground were doing a couple of years earlier, and giving it an art rock bent. Repetition is another key word here. And the album's best and most famous example of that is the incessant, unforgiving, unendingly descending riff that characterizes the sweaty, frothing beast of rock and roll menace that is I Wanna Be Your Dog, one of the band's, and indeed one of Iggy Pop's signature songs. Yeah. This and other gloriously chaotic and punishing tracks, such as Real Cool Time, Not Right, and Little Doll, reveal the Stooges' belief in rock and roll as hypnotic trance. And this is where their underrated psychedelic aspect comes into play. It's the darker side of psychedelic rock, much less attuned to the jam band noodling of the San Francisco hippie bands, and much more attuned to the cryptic art rock and experimentation of the early Velvet Underground records and the theatrical dark psychedelia of the early Doors. In fact, Iggy Pop has gone on record many times citing Jim Morrison's visceral persona on stage as a key influence on him as a performer, and the Doors' spooky eeriness as an influence on the Stooges as a whole. While not quite the atomic bomb that the first two Led Zeppelin albums were, the Stooges' debut album was a seed that took its time to grow, and for the plant that grew out of it to wrap its coil-like leaves around the minds of like-minded, more anti-rock establishment rock music fans before punk rock actually exploded onto the musical landscape. The Stooges' second album would be an even bigger seed with an even bigger impact, but that's for the next episode in this series. Chris?
Well, yes, it is. Yeah, I love how you put teasers all the way through your stuff, man. You have a cinematic quality to what you do.
Well,
Uh,
thank you.
th- this album's incredible. It just there's something about it. It's so barely hinged,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but in an organized way. It
Yeah.
it it really is the epitome of organized chaos that, you already mentioned I Want to Be Your Dog. I love No Fun.
Yeah.
No Fun is my favorite song on the record because of all the songs, because it's got that little riff to it, but it's got like clap drums,
Yeah.
it's like a clap. It almost has like this, hey, almost like an ironic high school chant song, uh as done by Iggy Pop and the Stooges.
Yeah.
It just real. I mean, it's just ball sweating great. It really is.
That's it. It's all you can do is ball sweating great.
Yeah, it is a ball sweatingly great album.
On this episode, we analyzed the amazing year in music that was 1969. For the next episode, we're going to cover one of the most baffling and creatively depressing stories in rock history: the career of Rod Stewart. From 1969 to 74, either solo or with the Faces, he released a string of brilliant albums that, while consisting mostly of covers, were imbued with gritty soul and his unique ability to make acoustic music rock as hard as any done with electric instruments. Then, starting in the mid-1970s, he completely sold out and embraced being a pop star, starting a seemingly unending run of mediocre or worse albums filled with uninspired pop rock that pandered to the middle of the road and the lowest common denominator of lowbrow pedestrian interest. It's a perplexing story, and one the Curmudgeons intend to get to the bottom of. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report will bring you Rod Stewart. What the fuck happened?
Now, I know what everyone is saying to themselves at this point. Okay, there's been great discussion of rock and roll here, but where are all the black people, man? We need more black. We need some black people in here. Arturo, there were some black people that did some great stuff in 1969 too, correct?
The African Americans in 1969 produced some of the best music of 1969. And we're talking about Isaac Hayes and Sly Stone, and more specifically, Sly and the Family Stone. We've talked and will continue to talk about how 1969 was such a transformative year for rock music. We shouldn't forget about R&B and soul music, and that also went through a massive change by the end of the 1960s.
Oh yeah,
James Brown's innovations with funk had permeated throughout the musical landscape
very
and were
quickly. Yeah,
having their genre-altering and long-lasting effect.
absolutely.
Artists at the Motown label, particularly the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder, were slowly starting to edge their way toward artistic independence and broadening the sonic scope of their respective sounds. Meanwhile, also in Detroit, George Clinton's pioneering fusion of psychedelia and soul and rock with the band Funkadelic were still a year away, but down in the South, especially with Memphis's Stax record label, something was brewing that would serve as a harbinger for the sound of soul to come. Stax was always known as the grittier, rougher, edgier side of American R&B, epitomized by the likes of Otis Redding, Booker T and the MGs, and Johnny Taylor, as opposed to the sweeter, punchier, catchier version of R&B espoused by Motown that crossed over to the mainstream, i.e. white audiences in the 1960s. Isaac Hayes was a songwriter and producer who worked for Stax, helping pump out single after single and album after album by its factory line of bands and artists. After his solo debut album flopped in 1968, Hayes agreed to record a second album only if he were given complete artistic control. The result was 1969's Hot Buttered Soul, a milestone in what became known as symphonic soul and possibly even progressive soul. This is important because just a few years later, the blaxploitation movie craze would take America by storm,
Yep.
particularly among African-American moviegoers, obviously, and the original soundtracks for these films, often composed and produced by some of the biggest names in R&B, would become huge sellers on the Billboard album charts. Hayes himself would be a pioneer in this, with his excellent soundtrack to the pioneering blaxploitation film Shaft. But here was Hayes in 1969 serving up an expansive set of songs that pushed the boundaries of what R&B and soul could be. The music was rich in texture, pristine in its musicianship and production, and symphonic and epic in its widescreen cinematic scope. Hot Buttered Soul is the sound of soul music being elongated by a symphony orchestra and having its big beating heart exposed for all to see in an aural soundscape as large and wide as an Arizona desert. The album opens with a gently psychedelic, intense, brooding cover of Burt Bacharach and Hal David's Walk On By that hits the 12-minute mark. The next track is a Hayes original, another super long track that comes in at just 10 minutes called, I'm going to try my best here, Hyperbolic Syllabic Sequidally Mystic. It's all in one word. That merges funk and rock in a way that slyly presages what George Clinton would do a year later. Side B opens with the lovely Charles Chambers, Sandra Rhodes ballad One Woman, before ending with the record's magnum opus, a searing, powerful, slow-burning, yet intense, narrative-filled version of Jimmy Webb's story of infidelity, By the Time I Get to Arizona. The album hit #1 on the R&B chart, #8 on the Billboard pop chart, and almost single-handedly ushered in the era of R&B and soul as a genre accommodating to the album as an artistic statement. R&B and soul music fans had never heard anything like this before. It must have been what rock music fans felt when they heard Radiohead's Kid A for the first time. An album that challenges the listener to not just engage with the music, but to also seek out what influenced the music they're listening to and hearing. It's a testament to Hayes' steady hand as a band leader and Marvell Thomas and Alan Jones's gifts as producers that the album has not lost an inch of its majestic power throughout the years. Chris?
No, it hasn't. I don't think Isaac Hayes is an Earthling. There's something about his.
He died several years ago.
Oh yeah. Oh well, I got you. He was not an Earthling. He is not an Earthling. He never will be an Earthling. There was something celestial about what Hayes did. They're just talk about space funk. I mean, that's really what it was. It was just this gorgeously lush, just sensual exploration of just really adventuresome. I don't think he was about the most adventuresome of all of these early funk guys that we're talking about. And he just there was a depth to the productions. There was again the sensuality is what's off the charts. I mean, yeah, Brown has his own thing. Like he has his grunts and he has his sweats and he has his sexuality, but that's more animalistic. Whereas like Hayes is like this other this undefinable. It's not the id, and it's not it's not sexuality. It's sensuality, but it just has this otherworldly quality. I keep using these words, but that's what it is. And there's not an album like Hot Buttered Soul at all. It's just the bottom of it. It's bottom heavy and it's lush and it just it hits you right in the gonads. It's pretty sensational. And so
it doesn't pump your nads, it soothes your nads.
Yes, it definitely soothes those nads, baby.
All right. So the next great R&B soul monument record of 1969, Sly and the Family Stone with Stand. When Sly and the Family Stone emerged from San Francisco in 1967, there was absolutely nothing like them in American popular music. Ostensibly an R&B soul outfit started by band leader, singer, keyboardist, and former radio DJ Sylvester Stewart, they first grabbed people's attention with their flamboyant hybrid of urban African-American chic and the hip hippie fashion of the day. They were also a rarity at the time in the fact that they were a mixed race band. Most importantly, though, it was their strikingly eclectic and versatile musical palette that made people take notice. Their brand of R&B could be as sweet as Motown and as gritty as Stax, while they could seamlessly transition to driving rock and roll while segueing to booty-shaking funk, and end it all by tickling the mainstream's fancy with perfectly constructed pop. So fluid was the band's ability to go in and out of genres that they made it seem that genre classifications were unnecessary in the first place. In late 1967, they blasted into the Billboard pop chart with the classic Dance to the Music, hitting number 8 with a sound akin to Motown beats and rhythms on steroids, with a kaleidoscope of textures, rock guitar riffs, funk bass lines, a gospel style organ, and punchy Stax style horns. It was and still is a perfect dance floor song that is irresistible. The following year, the socio-politically turbulent cesspool that was 1968, Sly and his band hit pay dirt with Everyday People, a call for racial and social unity couched in the most immaculately crafted example of pop soul anyone had done to that point, and it shot straight to number 1 on the pop chart. So, entering 1969, all eyes were on Sly Stone and what he would do next. The result was Stand, with an exclamation point. An album that, on one hand, consolidated their hyper-diverse musical style and societal message of inclusion and harmony, while on the other hand, expanded it to magnified technicolor levels. Hot Fun in the Summertime was another stab at classicist pop, showing how much ease Stone had with the form, and it went straight to number 2 on the pop chart. But it's the album tracks that show off the record's true brilliance. I Want to Take You Higher takes Dance to the Music's turbocharged rock soul into overdrive, if that's even manageable and imaginable. And it's best seen and heard in the concert film documentary about the Woodstock Festival. While positive funk vibes abound on You Can Make It If You Try, Stone proves that he isn't some blissed out, ignorant hippie by acknowledging the futility of racial conflict on Don't Call Me N-Word Whitey. Sex Machine, not the James Brown song from the following year, shows how adept the Family Stone are at doing the ultra funky, stretched out jam style of R&B that Isaac Hayes was already doing at this time. And of course, there's the title track that, while only hitting number 22 on the pop chart, serves as the album's clarion call and mission statement, touching on Sly Stone's tenacious and determined belief in humanity's capability for unity and togetherness, starting as a classic Motown-style vamp before breaking down into a vicious funk groove. The way the album pointed the way to the future of R&B and soul was not just in its innovative merging and fusion of styles. It was how broad and widespread Sly and the Family Stone's appeal ultimately was on this, the album that elevated them to superstar status. White, long-haired, rock-loving hippies could get into them and indeed loved them, as evident by their show-stealing performance in Woodstock. They were adored as well by R&B, soul, funk aficionados in African-American culture, and as evident by their high placings on the Billboard chart, they were embraced by the mainstream pop music audience as well. Why is this important? Well, following in Sly Stone's wake, and right before disco blew up in the mid-1970s, the period of 1970 to 75 saw a golden period for R&B, soul, funk music, where multiple artists were selling millions of records and having dozens of hits. This could not have happened if their audience was just black. These artists and groups had substantial white fans in America as well. And while Motown indeed crossed over to the white mainstream on a singles basis, it was Sly and the Family Stone who made it perfectly okay to ignore both ethnic and genre boundaries in music, come together, and just groove on an albums basis. Disco would go on to some measure to do that too, as would hip hop and electronic dance music. But Sly and the Family Stone did it first, and were doing it within the context of the traditional rock, R&B, soul template. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. They could write a great pop song, but they also were able to make funk as jazz too.
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
there's a real sort of improv and just sort of real sort of adventurous quality to a lot of their stuff. Like the song "Sex Machine" on here
Yeah.
is just, I mean, it's just wonderful. It's marvelous because it crawls in all kinds of weird, uh, twisty, bendy directions, and it's just
Right.
it's basically it's cosmic slop of the highest order.
Yeah.
And
Before Funkadelic, we're doing Cosmic Slop.
yeah, exactly. And the same thing with "Don't Call Me N Whitey" is the same thing.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
I just invented a term there. They were very very good at the cosmic slop, but then
Hmm.
they could also pull out everyday people.
Right.
And I want to take you higher. And
Right.
so they knew how to. It was like different strokes for different folks,
Right.
and they had that ability. And and their weapon of choice, their main ace in the hole was Larry Graham,
The bass player. Yeah.
who may be the greatest bassist of all time. One of them. He's right there with like Jamerson and Flea and a few others
Right.
as one of the great bassists.
And Geddy
And
Lee.
and Geddy Lee. And the thing with Larry Slam, he was a thumb slapper, and
Right.
he's one of the great thumb slappers of all time. And there is some just awesome thumb slap shit on this record for sure.
Mhm.
And yeah, they basically were the people's funk band, weren't they?
They
Because
really were. Yeah.
they were multi-ethnic, because they had that melodic sensibility, but they also could do that kind of jazzy, funky kind of improv kind of thing that like really lent itself well to live performance. Hence
Right.
why they're so remembered for what they did at Woodstock.
Right.
Um, yeah, they're another one. I mean, to me, they might also be aliens. I mean, Isaac Hayes was definitely an alien. Sly Stone was probably just on drugs. Uh, he was,
He just published his memoir.
yeah, and he's been sober for 4 years. Yeah,
Four, 4 years.
yeah, he's been sober for 4 years. Imagine
Just
that.
4 years.
Yeah,
How old is he now? He's in his
he's
70s.
he's 81, or he's about to be 81.
He just got
So,
sober in his mid 70s.
yep, yep. That's the thing. It was a struggle for him, but yeah, but you can't really ascribe it to the drugs. I mean, he was an eccentric genius, for sure. And this album is just sort of rich evidence of that
Mm,
genius. And
right.
there's the pop and then the jazz, and it's
Mhm.
just a really great eclectic record for
Right.
sure.
Okay, Chris. Now, another development that happened in 1969, something called Southern rock became a thing, and it
Yeah,
centered around three bands, only one of which was really from the South.
yeah, absolutely. So, yep, we are making the claim, and I think it's pretty much true that you can say that the birth of Southern rock as we know it really took place in 1969, and there were three bands who were primary in this creation, as we see it, and that's Creedence Clearwater Revival, the band, and hey, the Allman Brothers Band. So
Right.
let's talk about these artists and a little bit about Southern rock and about these artists and about these albums. So I love Southern rock. It always has been and always will be my jam. How does one define Southern rock, however? That's a tougher exercise than I thought it would be coming into this episode because you see, Southern rock has always been a little bit like the Supreme Court justice's take on obscenity for me. I know it when I hear it.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's the obvious contributions to its aesthetic of Leonard Skinner in the 1970s and the Black Crowes in the 1990s. Bluesy, jammy soul rock to get wasted to with your buddies while wearing bell-bottom jeans.
Right.
But there's a lot more to it than that. Here, to me, is the essential formula. Take the twang and sincerity of country music, then
Hmm.
graft that to the soul and bottom-heavy sensuality of the blues. Now splice that to the propulsive rhythms of boogie woogie, both the Chuck Berry variety and the more laid-back Fats Domino version of it. Finally, surgically attach all of that to the deeply affecting melodies of both gospel and Tin Pan Alley. Oh, and don't forget to layer loud guitars, at least two of them, and passionate vocals on top of the mix. Southern rock is one of rock and roll's great alien beings, And Southern rock as we know it arguably was born in 1969. We are, in fact, making that argument that this is ground zero for Southern rock. Ironically, it was a band from San Francisco area, the San Francisco Bay Area, more specifically Berkeley,
Yep.
that was at its forefront. And that's Creedence Clearwater Revival. That band, CCR, translated the vibes of the Deep South, especially the Bayou territories of Louisiana and Texas, perhaps better than anyone ever did. CCR, to me, they might have had the most amazing single year of any American band ever in 1969.
Yeah.
They put out three amazing records in the same year: Bayou Country, Green River, and Willie and the Poor Boys. All three of them are great. All three of them just rock, but all three of them also have a lot of depth to them. Put them together, and they might as well be one big, long Southern rock jam.
Yeah.
The band offers up tremendous covers of Southern bred tunes, which range from the standard Cotton Fields and the Blues Nugget Midnight Special on Willie and the Poor Boys to Little Richard's Good Golly Miss Molly on Bayou Country. They also crank out just an absolutely stunning array of John Fogerty originals. These are among the greatest rock songs ever recorded. Perhaps you've heard of a few of these: Down on the Corner, Fortunate Son, Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, Keep on Chugin, which I love, Born on the Bayou, Wrote a Song for Everyone. Wow. The end result is a catalog that's as rousing, as rollicking, and as rocking as any other American band ever produced, if not more so. This was bona fide reverence for the American vernacular. Listen closely and lovingly enough, and you will hear the germ of Southern rock, I swear. The same can be said actually for the band's self-titled masterpiece. Yes, the band was mostly Canadian, and yes, they're as famous for backing up Bob Dylan on his 1960s tour as they are for their own output. But they did have two secret weapons that afforded them credibility as interpreters of the music of the southern United States. One was the literary gift Robbie Robertson possessed as a songwriter, as he could marry musical styles with narratives that evoked the South's tortured history. See especially The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, Gorgeous Civil War Lament, and Up on Cripple Creek, which is straight up Mississippi wisecrack and back porch funk, featuring the marvelous clavinet and organ work of Garth Hudson. The other secret weapon the band possessed was drummer and singer Levon Helm. He was one member of the band not from Canada, and hey, lucky for them, he was the child of cotton farmers from Turkey Scratch, Arkansas. How's that for authenticity? Helm's southernness drove deeper than biography, though. He had an ear for the quirky rhythms of both rhythm and blues and honky-tonk style country, which he reflected in his idiosyncratic drumming. He also had an amazingly gruff growl as a vocalist and could convey a whole host of emotions that made him a master storyteller. It's no surprise, then, that he seemed to be Robertson's go-to for his most narrative and well-researched songs, which on this album, the band includes the wonderfully ragtime-evoking revivalism of Rag Mama Rag. I would say that the album, the band, is ultimately a little too folky and purely rootsy to count as true Southern rock, but the bones are definitely lurking underneath. Now, let's stop being cute and get to the real Southern rock, as the stuff actually from the South, as in the stuff that was cranked out in the sonic template that we expect when we think of Southern rock. That also came in 1969, and boy, did it come in amazing, innovative fashion. Welcome to the world of recording, George's Allman Brothers Band. Yes, the Allman Brothers Band, perhaps the most stereotypical of all Southern rock bands, debuted in 1969 with their 7-song self-titled effort. The album finds organist Greg Allman crooning his searing originals such as It Ain't My Cross to Bear and Whipping Post. Allman sang Blue-Eyed Soul as well as anyone who ever lived, and it shows wonderfully on this album. The album also finds the band blasting out extraordinary covers of Blues Burners by Spencer Davis and Muddy Waters. The former, album opener Don't You Want No More, introduces us to guitarists Duane Allman and Dickie Betts, whose awesome harmony lead lines became a staple of the Southern rock stew. This was only the beginning of the Duane Allman legend, whose soulful side guitar playing eventually grew absolutely just astonishing. His work here on It Ain't My Cross to Bear and Trouble No More are especially awe-inspiring. The other main innovation of the Allman Brothers that they introduce on this album is the use of two drummers, Jai Johanny Johansson and Butch Trucks,
Otherwise known as JMO for the former.
JMO,
Yeah.
to effectively create a chugging rhythm engine underneath all of the incendiary guitar noise. So yeah, if Southern rock is an alien life form, the Allmans were its foremost aliens, furiously perfecting an entire genre here. CCR captured the sound and the spirit, and perhaps the band captured the soul, but no one captured the guts and the balls of the Southern thing better than the Allmans. Their contribution to the rock and roll canon is immeasurable as a result. Arturo, what's your opinion of all of these albums and artists and of Southern rock as a genre?
Yeah,
As a genre.
early Southern rock is the best.
Yep.
Listen, what I will add is in regard to the Allman Brothers band, it needs to be known that guitarist Duane Allman, he was the leader of the band and he was the heart and soul of the band.
Yes.
He was the one who guided them. He was the one who gave them their musical direction. He led the band and he was the band leader. And one truly underrated aspect about the Allman Brothers band that people don't when Duane was in the band, he would die 2 years later in 1971 in a motorcycle accident.
Yeah.
But the Duane era Allman Brothers band, the one underrated aspect of them is the jazz element in their music.
Yeah, that's true.
You really hear that come out in the live album, Live at the Fillmore East.
Oh yeah.
When they did their improvisation.
Oh, he was hugely influenced by Miles Davis.
He was a big Miles Davis fan. And early Allman Brothers band, particularly as a live band, you can hear the jazz element in their music come out. Duane was a very, very he was a technical virtuoso. He was a genius guitar player, but he was also really, really eclectic and versatile in his styles and what he can do with the guitar and where he can take a band into. Honestly, Duane Allman era Allman Brothers band is the only Allman Brothers band you need to listen to, because after Duane died, it was just a slow descent into crappiness. Sorry to say for all the Allman Brothers band.
Eat a Peach is a great record, though.
But you know what? But
because Duane plays on 3 of those songs, so
Duane is all over the record. Even the studio tracks, Duane plays on those songs.
A couple of them anyway. There's 3 without him and 3 with him.
Right. And the ones with him are the best, right?
Yeah.
So, that goes to show, so yeah, that's one thing about the Allman Brothers band that people need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the best bands of all time. Just the interplay, and people need to talk about Dickie Betts too. It's not like Dickie Betts was chopped liver.
No,
I mean, the way that those two combined what they did. I mean, especially like later on when Dickie starts writing songs, and some of
he brought more of a profound country influence into the Allman Brothers band.
Yeah, he did, but not only that, but he also, I mean, the greatest double lead lines that the Allmans ever did are on Dickie Betts songs. In memory of Elizabeth Reed, Blue Sky. And some of that stuff. Although I will say that the double lead line on Whipping Post is pretty goddamn good.
Good too. Yeah.
Yeah, really good. And there's that. But at the same time, Dickie, it's got to be tough being a guy like Dickie Betts, being one of the best guitarists in the world and not being the best guitarist in his own band.
Yeah, because Duane was so damn good.
Yeah, I mean, like you think about like Duane's slide solo on It Ain't My Cross to Bear.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, yeah, I'm the second best guitarist in this band. Fuck. Yeah. Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon,
Help us expand our little community and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
All right.
Imagine that.
Anyway, Chris, so we're talking about how 1969 was so awesome. We've mentioned several albums. There are several more
Yes.
to talk about, and we'll do this in a lightning round fashion. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 more, right? And what we're going to talk about here, okay, the first one, Captain Beefheart and his double album masterpiece, Trout Mask Replica. Now, if you take a first listen to this album and its utterly bizarre song structure, complex polyrhythms, out of time, out of tune sounding guitars, and myriad atonalities, you might think this whole record was improvised and put together in a rush. Nope, quite the opposite. Every single note of music was written and composed by Captain Beefheart, aka Don Van Vliet himself, and transposed to the piano by the band's drummer John French. French was classically trained, and he could read and write music, which was fortunate because he was then able to teach the rest of the band not just the difficult songs, but how to play them as well. 8 months of intense practice and living communally gave birth to this double album behemoth, of which there had never been anything like before. It's an album that didn't sell well, none of Beefheart's albums did, but became an instant cult classic whose status only grew throughout the decades and became a cornerstone influence on post-punk, alternative, and indie rock. Chris?
Yeah, this album, I admire it more than I like it. I mean, to me, I have a hard time taking it seriously because it is so wacky.
Yeah.
But I admire it because it is intentional, and it's a fun album to read about because, you read about how they were living and just this, I mean, living with an oddball like Don Van Vliet. Could you imagine being these guys and figuring that out? And you're trying to be in a band with a guy like that who
Yeah.
just, was on a whole different level. I mean, he was genius level in terms of what he was coming up with, but like you said, the challenge of translating that and the
Yeah.
challenge of like trying to actually like ground him on the earth,
Yeah.
and actually like, okay, Don, we need you to, we need you to concentrate here.
Right.
you know, I mean, it must have been like working with at a school for the gifted, or or a
And he
school.
was, and he wasn't a druggie at all.
No, he wasn't. I mean, it's like a school for the mentally challenged or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe he was on the spectrum or something. But I've read about that where like the guy that you mentioned there, the band leader, and like how much of a struggle that was for
Yeah.
him to translate Beefheart and Trout Mask Replica. Again, I admire it more than I like it. It's dense, and maybe I've just never had the patience to try to want to deconstruct it. But
You should.
hey,
You should. It really
it,
is fantastic.
it's an accomplishment. I'll give it that. It's certainly an accomplishment.
Well, the next person had no problem translating his music.
Nope.
That is Frank Zappa and his album Hot Rats. Now, Frank Zappa, who was the producer for Captain Beefheart's Trout
Yes.
Mask Replica, also made waves in 1969 with the album Hot Rats, the first album he put out under his own name and not under the moniker of the Mothers of Invention. He had eventually dissolved them by that point. Essentially, this is the Zappa album for people who don't like Zappa.
Yep.
If you are turned off by the toilet humor and misogyny in his lyrics, his instrumental forays into silly cartoon music, or his heavy-handed satire, then give this one a spin because it's one monumental jam of a record.
Yeah.
Mostly instrumental. Captain Beefheart sings on one song, Willie the Pimp. This album perfectly encapsulates everything that was good about Zappa in one progressive rock jazz fusion package of excellence. The serious composer side to Zappa is in full display here, as are his devastating virtuoso guitar skills. Chris?
Yeah, well, not just that, but his arrangement skills too. I mean, there's just some extraordinary stuff on Hot Rats. I mean, just Peaches and Regalia, with the xylophone and the clarinet,
Yeah.
and there's just the exotic instrumentation that takes place on that. Obviously, his guitar soloing on Willie the Pimp is just amazing. And
Hmm.
then you get the gumbo variations where you get Jean-Luc Ponty
Yeah.
jamming the fuck out on violin.
Hmm.
And they pull off the neat trick of seamlessly transitioning a violin solo into a guitar solo.
Yeah.
It's still it's if you're not listening closely, you will miss when the violin becomes the guitar.
Yeah.
And that's a really neat trick. And then you've got
That's just at great production skills, really, you
oh
know?
yeah, and then you've got some other great stuff like "Son of Mr. Green Jeans" is an extraordinary song, and great horn arrangement on that. So this is Zappa. The reason that we had to take him seriously because the guy was a true musical genius, and he hand wrote everything. By the way,
Yeah.
he in like this really beautiful ornate handwriting
Hmm.
that he composed everything. He was a
Yeah.
composer,
Yeah. He was
legitimate.
classically trained as well. He could read and write music. Yeah.
Yeah, and everything that he did was notated to the nines and to the hilt, and so I think his skill, the level of skill that's on Hot Rats, is practically unmatched. There's very few albums that are existing at that level of skill in the history of rock and the rock canon, and so it's one of my favorite albums of all time.
Right.
And it's one of those albums, it's kind of funny. Like if you take uh, to your credit, Art, that you take like maybe my list of my 50 favorite albums of all time, at
Mm.
least 20 of those are ones that you introduced me to.
No, you
And
don't think?
yeah, and Hot Rats is one of them. Yeah.
I introduced you to Hot Rats. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, no, it was through you that I first
Hmm.
caught on to Hot Rats.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. All
Hmm.
right. Okay. Now, the next album here from 1969, that's a great one that should be listened to and adored. The Velvet Underground's self titled album, The Velvet Underground. Lou Reed consolidated his control of the band after having multi instrumentalist John Cale kicked out of the band. Egos clashing, both of those are alpha males, right?
Yeah.
Effectively beginning the Velvet Underground Mach 2. Reed wanted to move the band in a slightly more commercial direction, hopefully getting them on the radio while still maintaining their artsy, esoteric edge. While they succeeded at the latter, they unfortunately did not succeed at the former. But like anything the Velvets did, their self titled album has aged astonishingly well and remains a lovely jewel in their overwhelmingly influential and important discography. The first half of the album, especially, has some of the most hauntingly beautiful ballads Reed ever wrote, with Pale Blue Eyes and Candy Says. While Cale wasn't there anymore to push the experimental envelope, Reed's penchant for rock and roll menace and groove had not left the door, with tracks like Some Kind of Love and What Goes On. The second half of the record is a little too uneven with some songwriting misfires, but it's still a terrific album with one of the best A sides of all time. Chris?
Yeah, it's like their stuff, like you said, that they got more commercial as they went along, and obviously it came to full fruition the next year
Right.
when they did Loaded, which is my favorite of the VU records. But here's kind of where it starts, where it's kind of funny. People must have been that must have been a real curveball after they
To
do white light, white heat, and
do this.
and people are expecting wacky shit about transvestites, with like all kinds of like screechy, screechy, scratchy, scroochy,
Yeah.
and then here comes a pop album. Like,
Yeah.
what? So yeah. So anyway, neat feat, and kind of shows what Lou Reed in his genius that there was nothing that guy couldn't do.
Nothing. Yeah, he's one of my favorite songwriters of all time. Next, one of my other favorite songwriters of all time, but
Richard Thompson.
he wasn't a songwriter quite yet.
Yeah.
This is Fairport Convention's album Liege and Leaf. The band's third album in the span of 1 year was also their third album with singer Sandy Denny, and it's the one that perfected their fusion of traditional English folk music with electric rock and roll. The band, with the brilliant Richard Thompson on guitar, had a knack for immaculate arrangements and managed to make these traditional songs rock hard, yet have an alluring, haunting quality that beckons repeated listening in order to capture the gorgeous details in the band's exquisite, complex interplay that somehow leaves plenty of space in the music. To this day, it's still one of the two greatest British folk rock albums of all time, with Thompson a few years later creating the other of the two. Chris?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, it's his guitar playing is subtle on this record.
Yeah.
It's not quite as
Bombastic.
yeah, it's not quite as bombastic as you got there in the 70s, but no, I agree with you. I think that for folk rock, that's the surprising thing is that they're true to it, their stuff. And I read his a couple years ago when we did a Richard Thompson episode. I read
Right.
his he wrote a memoir. It's called Bee Swing,
Yeah.
where he talks about it, and a lot of the influences were the stuff that was coming from northern England and Scotland. I mean,
Yeah.
that's really where it was, and it's sort of the North England scene, and sort of harkening back to not just music hall, but like 1900s, 1910s,
Right.
and all of that. And so for them to be able to get that authenticity, but then rock it out
Yeah.
is really an accomplishment. And Sandy Denny was an incredible singer. So yeah, just absolutely just beautiful stuff. And so yeah, Richard Thompson is my jam, and Legion Leaf is part of that.
Next, another of my personal favorite bands, The Kinks, and their album Arthur, or the Decline and Fall of the British Empire. In the Kinks' classic album of the year before, the Village Green Preservation Society, Ray Davies created a masterpiece whose dominant theme was lamenting and mourning for an old English culture quickly disappearing in the face of modernity, gentrification, and generational indifference. That theme was explored again on Arthur, but this time Davies personalized it by creating a narrative centered around a common working class bloke named Arthur Morgan, whose son is emigrating to Australia with his wife and kids. It's loosely based on Davies' own personal history, as his older sister emigrated to Australia with her husband back when Davies was a teenager. And it was originally intended to be the soundtrack to a play that was to be produced for British television. The play never quite materialized, but the music that survived is phenomenal. Yet another masterpiece for one of the few English songwriters who can rival the Lennon-McCartney partnership shot for shot. And I mean that.
Yeah.
No one but the Kinks could take traditional English music hall stylings and show tunes and make them alternately rock and sparkle with authentic pathos, humor, and socio-political commentary. Chris?
Yeah, if this album only had Victoria on it and the rest of it was a piece of crap, it would
Yeah.
still be notable because Victoria's on it. Victoria might actually be my favorite Kinks song. That is just a towering monument to just sort of just pop goodness.
Right.
And so yeah, they were just masters of the pop idiom at this point, to be able to take a pop song and to make, and like you said on the 1968 episode, that effectively Ray Davies was a sociologist,
Yeah, he
and
was. Yeah.
he's bringing that skill to bear here again. And so you take that incisive eye with his and Dave Davies' gift for pop hooks, and you put them together, and it's just astonishing. And so yeah, Victoria, a plus level stuff.
Yeah.
And
I've always said that if you take the Beatles year by year and
mhm.
take the Kinks year by year and end it around 1970, the Kinks match up. They really
Yeah,
do in a lot of ways.
yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, well, especially in the latter part of that in
Yeah.
68, 69. I
Right.
mean, with this record in Village Green, I mean, that's a 1-2 punch right there of extraordinary measure.
Yeah. Speaking of extraordinary punch, oh boy, Neil
Yeah.
Young's Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. This is the album where Neil Young became Neil motherfucking Young.
Yep.
Two of his most famous long form jams are on it in the form of Cowgirl in the Sand and Down by the River, as is one of his signature songs, the crunchy, rocking Cinnamon Girl. But you don't need me to tell you how great this album is when we have this podcast's resident Neil Youngologist on board. Chris?
Yeah, this album is incredible. It's one of my favorites of all time. This is the only fully realized true Crazy Horse album that they did with Danny Whitten,
Yeah.
who was Crazy Horse's original guitarist and band leader. Neil hooked up with this band, and obviously became friends, and they became kind of his muses for his jamminess, and to get in touch with his inner soloist, and just sort of brought out the majesty of his 1953 Gibson Les Paul.
Right.
And Whitten just had this real gift. He was an amazing rhythm player, and so just there's almost a jazz interplay feel to Down by the River and Cowgirl in the Sand, the way that almost like a kind of a saw. It almost works as almost like a hand saw. The way that the rhythm guitar that Whitten provides kind of cuts through, and finds the spaces in between what Neil is doing on lead guitar. It's just extraordinary interplay, and there's just an energy to the record. Like even the stuff that's more poppy, like The Living End, just really great melodic sensibilities on this album. And Whitten was also a great harmony vocalist. And so the harmony vocals on this album are incredible. The interplay between rhythm guitar and lead guitar is incredible. And just I think the songwriting all around, it just as a 35-minute 7-song record, it's just about damn near perfect. And again, like you said, it's when Neil became Neil motherfucking Young. And I still say of all of the Crazy Horse albums, it's the
Mhm.
best. Zuma is close, but
Zuma's my pick for the best Crazy Horse album.
yeah, Zuma's close, but everybody knows it's just Nowhere still takes the cake, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, it has those classic radio songs, of course, but
Yeah, and that's
anyway,
part of it. But go
yeah.
ahead.
All right, next, the Flying Burrito Brothers with the Gilded Palace of Sin. This is the last of our lightning round album section. The Byrds had already started inching toward country rock with 1967's Younger Than Yesterday, and the trippy and psychedelic take on country rock that was 1968's The Notorious Byrd Brothers. Graham Parsons joined the band for a brief time and helped them produce the landmark country rock statement album Sweetheart of the Rodeo, also in 1968, before he left the band supposedly as an act of protest against the Byrds' decision to play shows in apartheid-ruled South Africa, but really was because he wanted to hang out and do drugs with Keith Richards. In any case, bassist Chris Hillman left the Byrds to join Parsons in his new band, which was the Flying Burrito Brothers. The resultant first album, The Gilded Palace of Sin, is a masterful collection of songs that manages to blend Parsons' poetic songwriting with the honesty and heart-wrenching pain of the best of country music, while also highlighting Parsons' stirring, soulful voice. The fact that it still sounds astounding today is a testament to how influential and impactful the album was, despite it not selling that many records. It peaked at only number 164 in the Billboard chart.
Yeah.
Numerous country music artists, particularly of the 1980s new traditionalist movement, have cited it as an inspiration. Travis Tritt, Vince Gill, Alan Jackson, Clint Black, and Randy Travis. The alt country movement of the 1990s is another offspring of this album. Uncle Tupelo, which gave birth to Wilco,
Yeah.
Lucinda Williams, the Jayhawks, Ryan Adams, they've all sung its praises and acknowledged their debt to it. It's an album that should be in everyone's record collection, assuming you still buy physical media. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really eccentric in the sense that it's ostensibly a country rock record, but it has R&B covers.
Yeah.
With the Dark End of the Street and Do Right Woman on it. And so it's country, it's stoned country rockers doing R&B. And so so it just has an aesthetic to it that's pretty singular. And Parsons was just genius as a songwriter, as a player, as a singer. And the fact that Chris Hillman went with him, as opposed to sticking around with McGuinn, tells you everything you need to know about how majestic Parsons could be, and how charismatic he was as a band leader and as a songwriter. So Really great stuff on this record. This week was the first time I'd heard it in years, and I missed it.
Mhm.
And they actually show up. We're going to talk about them a little bit here in a bit, but they played the Altamont concert that year
Yeah.
and rocked the fuck out
Yeah, yeah. The,
as
the
part of
the
it.
the little bit that you see in the Maisels documentary film "Gimme Shelter," they sound amazing. You know.
They do, and it just so great live band, and it's too bad that that they couldn't last longer, that they couldn't have more of an influence. That it was just they really had a moment in time,
Right,
and that was it. And so you know, too bad it was as fleeting as it was, but they were a great band.
right. Well, Chris, we have to end this with mention of the two mega cultural events of 1969. One very positive, one very negative. The Woodstock Festival, the Altamont Festival. Boy, oh
Yeah. Yeah, Woodstock and Altamont, both testaments. Well, one, it's a testament to the fact that there's a fine line between utopia and nihilism,
yeah.
and also that there's power. There once in the non-social media saturation age, there once was a power to post-event marketing that was
Mhm.
indescribable.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I have cynicism about Woodstock only because of my experiences of covering Woodstock '99, which
Right.
ruined the brand. Woodstock '99 fucked it up so bad that the promoter, Michael Lang, who was the promoter of both of these shows, by the way, was the
Yeah.
co-promoter of both of these shows, that he couldn't get going with anything else. That
Yeah.
the Woodstock brand was dead because
I mean, but
'99.
it's a shame because what happened in the Woodstock 69 Woodstock was actually pretty great.
Yeah, and it was. I mean, if you think about it. So let's talk about a little bit about these shows. So we have two shows, Woodstock and Altamont. You had Woodstock, which was kind of the positive one of these, in the sense that it should have been a disaster, but wasn't.
Right.
It's one of the truest miracles of in the history of rock and roll that Woodstock wasn't a disaster. It took place August 15th to August 18th, 1969 in Bethel, New York, and it took place on a bowl-shaped dairy farm owned by a guy named Max Yasker, who the story of Woodstock is that they were left scrambling for venues. They kept getting turned down, and they couldn't get permits, or there was at one point there was a blackmail attempt. essentially essentially what one of the towns wouldn't hand over the permits unless they got kickbacks or something like that. It was pretty crazy. And so it took them so much time to find the venue, and they only had days to spare when they finally were able to get Yasker to allow them to use the farm, that they couldn't actually build ticket booths and fencing that would have been
Right.
adequate to keep people from bum rushing the grounds. And
Mhm.
so initially, they tried to make it, they were selling tickets for 18 to $24
Mhm.
beforehand, and they
Yeah.
did manage to sell, I think, like 100 something thousand tickets.
Mm.
But after the first 50,000 people showed up, and they realized that the word had gotten out extraordinarily well, that the entire New York State Thruway was backed up all the way to Massachusetts,
Jeez.
and pretty much collapsed there. They ended up getting 400,000 people. That they ended up
Nearly half a million.
Nearly half a million people. They had to make it a free show because there was no way to to fence people in, to keep people out. And so they end up with all these people, and you can't get in and out. And so now sanitation suffers. You can't get food in and out. They didn't plan to have this many people, and so what you end up with is you end up with a whole bunch of stoned young people in a big ass field with way too many of them on drugs, without adequate food, and basically exposed to the elements for 4 days,
Mm.
and yet only three people died.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about Woodstock.
Yeah.
400,000 people. not enough, not enough or sufficient food and water or bathroom facilities.
Yeah, the sanitation was bad.
Yet only 3 people died. I think that's a testament to how, yeah, it could have been a disaster, but it wasn't
But
because
they
of how
self-policed,
they
you
were
know?
self-police, and that self-policing comes from how positive the vibe was in
Yeah.
there. Or at least they had at least much better acid than the acid that was going around in Altamont.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, so there was that spirit of peace and love that ended up predominating, and it became this sort of organic. That's the most organic thing about Woodstock. Obviously, it was contrived as a festival, but because it got so overwhelmed, it needed to rely on this sort of organic positivity and peace that sustained it and was able to let the event take place. And then, of course, they had the good fortune of having a documentary crew, including Martin Scorsese, that was on hand to capture all of the music and all of the crowd stuff. And in 1970, they released a documentary that became legendary and really made Woodstock into the brand that it became. Essentially, this thing was a colossal money loser for everybody involved. I
Right.
mean, they all practically went bankrupt. And then, of course, the documentary comes out the next year, and then they made their money, and then some, and then some, and then some, and then some, and then some.
Yeah.
Uh,
And by the way, regarding that movie, go out and get the 4.5 hour extended edition.
yes,
Highly recommend. That's the better one.
which I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know that movie obviously is famous for all the split screening and
Right.
all of the cross cutting and all of that. But you know, in terms of the lineup, and it's kind of funny that without about a month ago, they didn't really have anybody lined up.
Yeah.
CCR was the first big band they got. Once they got CCR, that everybody else fell into place. So they end up with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Sly and the Family Stone, Santana, Richie Havens, Ravi Shankar, Canned Heat, Joe Cocker, The Band, Mountain, Sha Na Na. Yeah, strange but true. Sha Na Na was the second to last artist to play Woodstock. The last being Hendrix.
Yeah.
Hendrix ended the show on Monday morning. There was hardly anybody left, and
Well,
so
I mean, well, hardly anybody. There was still like,
30,000 people,
that's
like
still
40,000.
that's an arena right there.
Yeah, that's a lot of fucking people.
Yeah.
But and then that's when Hendrix played his famous rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. And so yes, it should have been a disaster. The fact that it wasn't is one of the great events in the history of rock, and that's one of the reasons that it's celebrated. That Woodstock became a vibe, and you know you have all that famous footage because there were so many people. There was a might have been military, but there was like some local operation that volunteered to helicopter people in, and so
Yeah.
you get all this footage of people arriving in and out by helicopter. And so, you know, Neil Young's got a song called Roll Another Number where he talks about being a million miles away from that helicopter day.
Yeah.
Well, that was the helicopter day in Woodstock. And so, in a way, that's worth celebrating because of what didn't happen. And again, I have some cynicism, you know, having been a part of Woodstock 99. I know that these things that they're basically human rights disasters waiting to happen.
Right.
You know, you're risking a human rights disaster anytime you have one of these. And Woodstock 69 was one of the great positive experiences of this. And then you get to Altamont, which happened 4 months later in December of 1969, and you get disaster that ended that show.
Right.
That show, it was a free concert at the Altamont Speedway in California, Tracy, California, which is just outside of San Francisco. They attracted 300,000 people, and they had, you know, for the age, one of the best
Yeah.
possible 1 day lineups imaginable.
Headlined by the Rolling Stones with Santana,
Santana, Jefferson
Jefferson
Airplane,
Airplane,
the Flying
Grateful
Burrito
Dead.
Brothers,
Yep.
Crosby, Stills, and Nash, the
And
Grateful
Young.
Dead,
Young
and
was there
Young,
too.
and
Yeah.
Young, and then the Grateful Dead was supposed to play, but didn't for a reason that became immediately apparent.
Yeah.
Turns out that having the Hells Angels work your security was not a good idea, and
Yeah. I mean, and it's
and
not just the
paying
Hells
them.
Angels.
Oh, I know that,
Yeah.
and I'll let you talk in a minute, but
Yeah.
but it turns out that paying a particularly violent wing of the Hells Angels in
Yep.
beer is a stunningly bad idea. And so the idea of maybe what you could say is that there's a contrast at Woodstock and Altamont. Woodstock is innocence realized, and Altamont is innocence lost. Wouldn't you agree,
Right.
Art?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the two reasons, and by the way, I'm going to be referencing a great book by Joel Selvin. He's a music journalist, and he's kind of like the predominant, like the authoritative historian on 1960s and 70s rock, especially out on the West Coast. He's written several. He wrote a great book about the hippie movement called Summer of Love. It covers actually the entire San Francisco scene up until 1971, believe it or not. But he wrote a book several years ago, not that long ago, called Altamont, The Rolling Stones, the Hells Angels, and the Inside Story of Rock's Darkest Day. Basically, Altamont comes down to two things. Number one, not just that they hired the Hells Angels, they hired the Santa Clara chapter of the Hells Angels, not the San Francisco chapter. The San Francisco chapter, they were used to kind of quote unquote policing and providing security for a lot of the hippie shows in San Fran earlier in the decade by the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. And so they were used to dealing with, like, drugged out crowds. They didn't hire those guys. They hired the other Hells Angels, the meaner, angrier, not so well. The San Francisco Hells Angels could be mean too, but
Yeah.
like the
Well,
much
yeah,
meaner, the much meaner, much harder Hells Angels is who they hired. Also, Joel Selvin attributes there are three things that was wrong with Altamont. Number one, yeah, the hiring of the Hells Angels. Number two, the acid, the LSD that was going around in Altamont was much, much worse than the acid that was going around in Woodstock. Like you said, in Woodstock, the mood was positive, and people policed themselves in Woodstock well because the mood was positive. The mood wasn't positive in Altamont because obviously it was not prepared well enough. The preparation was woeful, but also the bad drugs had seeped in to Altamont that you
yeah,
didn't have.
which not only included bad acid, but also included methamphetamines.
Right, that was
That,
getting there too. And it
yeah,
wouldn't surprise me if some of the Hells Angels guys were doing methamphetamine as well. Wouldn't
probably.
surprise me. They probably dealt in that shit anyway. But
Yeah.
so that's two things. And then the third thing, and in this book by I'm going to quote Joel Selvin. I'm going to quote him quite a bit actually. He really puts the blame on the Rolling Stones. He puts it squarely on Mick Jagger, to be specific. Let me quote what he says here. Okay. But when all the facts are presented, it's hard to see true responsibility lying with anyone but the Rolling Stones. The simple truth is that the Stones were always in charge of the concert, with Mick Jagger clearly making the calls behind the scenes. They were pushing for it to happen, trying to latch on to the allure of the San Francisco music scene. Many agents acted on their behalf. Obstruction was part of the strategy, but they all were doing Jagger's bidding. The Stones brilliantly, intentionally, it would seem, positioned themselves to be in control, but not to be responsible. The band carefully distanced themselves from any legal responsibility by letting John James, someone they didn't even actually know, sign the contract with Carter for Altamont. Carter, one of the arrangers of the concert. They
Yeah, he was their
also
road manager.
the
Yeah.
road manager, right? They also avoided the day-to-day decision making that went into the planning while still keeping their fingers on the strings behind the scenes. Like capos in the criminal underworld,
Hmm.
they built deniability into the system. And now a page later, Jagger seemed unconcerned about not having a location for the concert when he announced the free show at the New York press conference the day after Golden Gate Park fell through. Without the park, proper police support, public transportation, and a functioning infrastructure, that also vanished. So without the park, proper police support, public transportation, and a
Yeah.
functioning infrastructure also vanished. Although they had been playing with the idea since before the tour began, even as late as 4 days before the concert, when the band was still recording in Alabama, there was still no site, and yet plans went ahead. If Jagger had been willing to make a deal with Filmways, the company that they were making the movie, the Maysles brothers, to distribute the movie, the concert could have also taken place at Sears Point in Sonoma, where the large crowd could have been accommodated. The Hells Angels wouldn't have been in control, and the staging was already in place. But he wouldn't consider giving up movie profits from a distribution deal. Jagger was going to make the concert happen no matter what and maintain his arm's distance control. So he was willing instead to risk everything on a desperate last-minute move to some oil blotch on the far edge of the San Francisco Bay Area with no police, no infrastructure, no medical provisions, a decision that would become disastrous. Jagger had made the fatal error of believing his own hype. He bought into the myth of Woodstock, but he also believed that he could do it better. Woodstock had been a crowning achievement, but the Rolling Stones were not a part of it. Now they could write their own place into the history, and he expected that his concert would continue the good vibes and perhaps even be a bigger show of hippie values. Jagger wanted to cultivate the underground. Being considered cool by cognoscenti was new for the Stones. He was coming to San Francisco for a coronation. This was sheer media manipulation by a master. It backfired, of course, but Pauline Kael's, the great music journalist, her comparisons to Triumph of the Will may be more apt than the Maysles brothers would like to admit. Jagger wanted to be filmed strutting the stage as the emissary of the Dark Lord before his adoring masses. The Stones were determined to star in their own extravaganza. The people at Altamont were simply unwitting participants in their titanic vision.
Yeah, that is pretty harsh. Pauline Kael was the film critic for the New York Times for a long time, or excuse me, the New Yorker. She was with the New Yorker for a long time. Just to let you know. So anyway, but let's just talk about, well, what are we talking about exactly? What happened? Well, what happened is that ostensibly because they only landed the Altamont Speedway as a venue a few days before the concert, they didn't have time to build a real stage.
Yeah.
And so they were on a slope, kind of went into the crowd. There was no real barrier between the bands on the stage and the crowd. And so ostensibly the Hells Angels role was supposed to be a security to keep the crowd separated from the artists. Yeah. But the thing is when you get a bunch of tough knucklehead motorcycle gang guys and you load them up on beer and meth, and then you get the crowd that's on bad acid and meth and booze and everything like that. Well, the hostilities build throughout the day, and you get to the point where Marty Ballin of the Jefferson Airplane, he leaves the stage in response to some particular roughness that he saw, and they proceed to knock him out with a pool cue. And so there was that, and then by the end of the show, you've got the Rolling Stones up there, and they're so shook up that they actually stopped in the middle of Sympathy for the Devil with 3 songs into the set.
I believe they stopped several times.
Yeah, they stopped several times, but they stopped that one time and famously in the movie Gimme Shelter, you see Mick imploring with the people in the crowd at the front of the stage to be cool and to calm down and to just to take it easy. But what happens is during, I think it was Sympathy for the Devil, or Under My Thumb actually is the song that they were playing. What happens is a young African American kid named Meredith Hunter, who was 18 years old at the time, who autopsy revealed that he was high on methamphetamines at the time. He got into it with a couple of the the Hells Angels, and apparently was mad at Jagger and was trying to get at Jagger. And so
why was he mad at Jagger?
I have no idea. That's from what I read.
From what I read is that he was mad at one of the Hells Angels.
Yeah,
and that was what he pulled his gun at, not at Jagger. He pulled his gun.
No, he pulled the gun. He pulled the gun at the Hells Angels. And
Right.
so eventually they start jumping him, and it's clear as day. I remember you and I saw a reprint of "Gimme Shelter" at the Film Forum in New York City
Yeah.
in 1999,
Yeah.
and it's clear as day. You can see the gun
Yeah.
when they blow up the footage, and so he had pulled a gun, and so they ended up knifing and killing Meredith Hunter, the Angels. A couple of them got put on trial. They were acquitted a couple years later. It was declared self-defense. But the idea is that you end up with a situation that grows so out of control that a kid gets murdered at the front of the stage of a Rolling Stones concert with 300,000 people in attendance and the world watching. And so this is an utter disaster, and can't think of a better way for the 1960s to fold into the 1970s than that.
Yeah.
Talk about
Um,
your innocence lost.
yeah.
Weed and acid becomes cocaine, meth, and violence.
Yeah. There's a
Peace, love, and hope becomes depravity.
Right. Listen, man, there's a documentary movie called Days of Rage, The Rolling Stones Road to Altamont. This came out, I think, back in, I think several years ago. It came out. I think it came out 2021, I think, or 2020. And so it's pretty recent. And Joel Selvin is interviewed, and they interview a whole bunch of people who are a part of this, who are still alive. And something they mentioned that did not make it to the Maysles brothers film.
Yeah,
Okay. After the kid, Meredith Hunter, the young man, was killed and he was dead, people in the front of the audience, way up front, in front of the stage, were pleading for the Stones to stop.
yeah,
There were people yelling at the Stones, dude, you got to stop the show. Stop the show. Someone's
and
dead.
and they didn't.
And they didn't. And what happened, and this obviously did not make it to the Maysles brothers film, but the crowd picked up the dead body of Meredith Hunter and in crowd surfing style moved his body and put him on the stage in front of the Stones to show them, dude, a dead person is here. You have to stop. As soon as Meredith Hunter's body hit the stage, okay, the Hells Angels surrounded the body, got in front of it, and pushed the body back into the audience. So he was killed, crowd surfed onto the stage, and then kicked off the stage, the dead body. And what
That's fucked
happened,
up.
like, that's
Yeah,
fucked up. And this never made it to the film, but there is a photo of this, and you see like 3 or 4 Hell's Angels crowding around something in front of the stage, and Jagger a few feet away from them, with his face in his hands, like, oh my God, like that. And he's like showing extreme shock and horror. Jagger saw the dead body of Meredith Hunter put on the stage in front of his feet. And the Hells
yep,
Angels went there just really quickly, got in there, and just like threw the body back out.
yep. And they didn't stop the show.
They didn't stop the show. Well,
Yeah,
to be fair, had they
yeah.
stopped the show,
It would
there
have been a
might have been a
riot.
riot and more
Yeah,
people would have died. You know?
yeah. So they kind of at that point, you already have one person that you imagine a whole bunch of people rushing the stage with a bunch of drunk Hell's Angels with sharpened pool cues. Yeah,
Yeah.
that could have been a slaughter.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that is a fair point for them to make. But yeah, what a disastrous note. And that's what I say. These big festivals, at least in America, and this is like the legacy of Michael Lang. He's like the most incompetent promoter in terms of figuring things out. That it just like he always seems to have this. He had this illustrious history of possibly putting people in danger in any
Yeah.
show that he did. And in two cases, in Altamont and then in Woodstock '99, that ends up bad. Where Woodstock is this, they got 460,000 people at something where they planned for 50,000 and couldn't actually, function
Yeah.
in policing the grounds. Well, what they did is they planned for 250,000 people at an Air Force base on a 100-degree day in upstate New York, with no potable water on the ground and bottles of water only available for $4 a piece. What did they expect? You know,
Yeah.
and
People
and
are
and
gonna get pissed off.
and
Yeah.
and with Limp Bizkit, encouraging people to sexually assault women and be as violent as possible. What do you expect? So it just Michael Lang, he just died last year. R.I.P. But but the guy, he put his crowds in harm's way. I mean, that's kind of a legacy, and it paid off beautifully in an organic spirit in Woodstock '69. But boy, did it flop badly in a couple of other instances, as we've now realized. So we had to end this because that's Altamont really is just kind of a symbolic end to the '60s and beginning of the '70s. So we had to end the episode talking about the contrast of these shows, and just to be sober about the music was all well and good, but the culture was shifting, and not necessarily in the best way at this time.
Well, like I said, and the overall theme of this episode, if you were interested in learning, folks, basically the tone for the 1970s is set with all the music that came out in 1969. What the Stones did, what Zeppelin and the Stooges did, what the Who did, what Sly Stone and Isaac Hayes did, all the Southern rock that we talked about, even a lot of the other albums that we talked about. That's set, Neil Young, the great decade of the 1970s, that was Neil Young's decade. Set the tone was set with Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. The Flying Burrito Brothers set the tone for the Eagles. So I mean, it really is. This year set the tone for the decade to follow.
Yeah, absolutely, which makes it one of the most important and vital years in rock and roll history. And it's been, this has been a long episode, and it's been a fun episode, but there's a lot to talk about. But I think we needed to go at this length and at this depth. And I think that we've covered the waterfront pretty damn well here. Remember, this is not a great world for content like ours, but so we're holding the candle, not just for Rock Geek iconoclasts, but for people who like rich, focused content about culture like ours. And so thanks for hanging out with us, folks. And on that note, we encourage you, as we always do at the end of these episodes, to join our curmudgeonly community on Facebook. Arturo is continuing to roll out his year-by-year list of the greatest studio albums. He just put up 2013, which is the year that he met his wife. And he is going to unleash 2014 next. That was the last year I lived in the New York City area, so that holds some sentimental value for me as well. So read all about that. Join us at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. If you disagree with anything we've had to say here, or if you have any other thoughts to share about 1969, hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And also, and we're excited about this, we're in a consistent rhythm with this now. We're going to have a Spotify playlist that you can access in the show notes to wherever you access this here podcast, whether that was on Apple or Stitcher or Amazon or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Click on the link to the Spotify playlist and enjoy a lot of the music, and we did cover a lot of music. Enjoy that mightily through our Spotify playlist.